This country is in deep trouble, people. This country is rotten to the core, and somebody better do something about it. I want you to take your hand out of that bowl of Fritos, throw away your National Enquirer, and pick up the phone. Go ahead, pick it up, hold it up to your face, and dial 555-TALK. Open your mouth and tell me what we're going to do about the mess this country's in. Talk radio. It's the last neighborhood in town. People just don't talk to each other anymore. This country is in deep trouble, people. This country is rotten to the core, and somebody better do something about it. I want you to take your hand out of that bowl of Fritos, throw away your National Enquirer, and pick up the phone. Go ahead, pick it up, hold it up to your face, and dial 555-TALK. Open your mouth and tell me what we're going to do about the mess this country's in. Talk radio. It's the last neighborhood in town. People just don't talk to each other anymore. Let's go to the first caller. Night Talk, Agnes. Yeah.
I Love Lucy. Now, why don't they make more of them?
Those shows are ancient, Agnes. Lucille Ball must be at least 105 years old. The rest of the cast is dead.
Barry, Metrowave's going to be picking up the show starting Monday night. Link it to a national feed.
We have a very special guest with us. Kent is the classic American youth, energetic and resourceful, spoiled, perverse, and disturbed. Would you say that's an accurate description, Kent?
Barry, you should ask me if you want to have a guest on the show.
Why?
Because I'm the boss, Barry, that's why.
All you have to do is just be nice, okay?
Easy, Barry. You're part of the problem, you see.
I don't care what you think. No one does.
He's going down in flames, Dan.
So what?
You get the package and sent down to the station.
See, if I were you, I'd have my pretty assistant give the police a call. Take the bomb squad about 10 minutes to get down
Bomb
there.
squad? Why should I call a bomb squad? Tell me something. I'm curious. How do you dial a phone with a straitjacket on?
Sticks and stones may break your bones, but words cause permanent damage. I chose that line from the film to introduce today's recording in lieu of the tagline, which is "He exists because you listen," which is sort of equally sort of potent, I think. But you know, again, it's a bit like the line that you chose for A Simple Plan, Adi. I think it sums up the story quite well, sums up the themes, the harm that words can cause. Today's film that was under discussion is Oliver Stone's Talk Radio from 1988, based upon the play by Eric Bogosian, who also stars in the film as shock jock Barry Champlain. I think we should move on to a round of introductions. Would you like to go first, AD?
Yes, fine. I'm Adrian Mills. I am the program leader for the game design degrees at the University Centre Grimsby, and have been, I don't know, watching these kind of films for most of my life, which probably explains a lot.
It does indeed.
Me. That's me.
Mark, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, my name's Mark Hall. I graduated from the writing degree at Grimsby University Centre last year. Currently studying a PGCE there as well. Sort of a little bit of a writer here and there when I can, when I'm not shouting at children or working or making posters and such. So yeah, that's me.
Do you like making posters, Mark?
No, but whether you like it or not, you throw yourself into it, don't you?
Who doesn't like making a good poster?
I think this is an in-joke, isn't it? I think we should. Nobody will get that.
Forward, but I'm a teacher.
Yeah.
I think.
I'm Paul Lewis. I'm a very naughty boy. I think that's what my wife would say.
Would not be wrong. She
wouldn't be wrong.
Not the Messiah. Very
yeah,
naughty boy.
I'm a very naughty boy. Writer, lecturer, photographer, I don't know, whatever order you want to put it in. Human being. That's what I like to describe myself as.
I'm a human doing.
Oh, did I get it wrong? So, in terms of a synopsis, the film story, talk radio story, would anybody like to offer one?
So let me see what I've got written down. The original one, I wrote two. The original one was a bit wrong, because I was writing about the life of this talk show radio host. But then I accidentally realised I was writing about Frasier. So then I went back and watched the film. So what I've got. Let me just bring my little notes up. I only wrote a short one because in my mind it doesn't seem very much like a long film.
I think that's because the story time's condensed. It's 2 evenings.
Yeah,
really,
it's
isn't it?
really short, isn't it? It's only over a possibly even a week, maybe, or even less. So
I do feel like saying, sorry, Mark, to interrupt you. I do feel like saying, "I'm listening" in honour of the Frasier reference.
Good. At least someone is. So I've put a talk show radio host, the notorious and famous for generally being rude and not being afraid to say whatever he wants. And he starts to receive some hate mail and abusive calls regarding his Jewish faith, which is something that he regularly pokes fun at himself. The prospect of a national syndication for his show causes him to sabotage himself by riling his haters into such a frenzy that it leads to an Obi-Wan Kenobi-style death, where he is struck down and becomes more powerful than we could ever possibly have imagined. And the reason he sort of self-sabotages himself is it could possibly stem from a few things. Maybe his fear that his haters are right about him, the pressure of sort of national fame, and maybe a bit of a fear that the hate for him could spread nationwide rather than just over Dallas, where currently everyone hates him.
How I feel about Grimsby, really.
Yeah.
That was cracking, Mark. Good one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
AD, have you got one?
It's really similar, isn't it? It's American shock jock riles his audience to such a point that he reaps the inevitable rewards of his possibly hateful words, I guess. In a nutshell, if you want something for the box.
That's to the point. Yeah, I'll have a go. We've got Shock Jock Barry Champlain, played by Eric Bogosian, hosts a Dallas radio station, late night call-in talk radio station called Night Talk. And the evening that we first meet him, and that first night, that first recording goes on for about half an hour, doesn't it? That's just one evening's recording.
Yeah, it's about 26 minutes, that sequence.
It is, yeah. That's very... you watched closely there, Matt.
I did, yeah. Because I was shocked. I'm not shocked, but I was sort of really intrigued as to how long that opening sequence was. So I brought up the timer when it finished.
Yeah. And the second evening is of a similar length, isn't it? Of course.
Yeah.
But we meet him on an evening where his producer Dan, played by Alec Baldwin, has arranged for a representative of Metrowave, who's kind of looking at the show for the prospects of advertising revenue if the show would go national. And this representative is played by Dietz, John Pankow, who plays a character called Dietz. Sorry, and looking at Champlain's show Night Talk with the prospect of making it a national show. And then Champlain's life begins to unravel from that point because he has to sort of battle the demands of the corporate world, if you like, and his own sense of who he is, I think, which also involves his lover at the studio, Laura, played by Leslie Hope, and an attempt at sort of reconciliation with his ex-wife Ellen, played by Ellen Green, and also input from a regular in Oliver Stone pictures, John C. McGinley, who plays Stu, the engineer, which is a great part. I think it's such a good part. But yeah, and Champlain's tendency to antagonise his listeners escalates with a sort of neo-Nazi group called the Order, who begin by sending Champlain a dead rat in a shoebox and then escalate to murdering him at the end of the film. And it's all very uplifting. I think we could say, in the sense that you can look at it and say, thank heavens that I'm not Barry Champlain. So what about first encounters with the film? AD, would you like to go first?
I had watched this previously, but I remember very, very little of it. So I'm pretty sure I had seen it before. but I can't remember when or where. So I'm actually going to just come down and say, for all intents and purposes, this was like a fresh watch. So this was, I watched it a couple of times, and so this was, to me, I knew what it was about, and I knew, either I'd seen sections of it or whatever, something, I'm not sure, but to me this felt like the full first watch. So I'm not sure. I'm a big Oliver Stone fan, as we'll come to later, or of Oliver Stone around this time anyway. So I'm pretty sure I would have watched it. I just don't remember when or where or how. So for all intents and purposes, this was probably this is my first encounter with the film that I actually remember. So, interesting one.
Mark, was it your first encounter with the film?
It is. Yeah, it was. It's to be honest, when you mentioned that it's the film that we were going to be talking about, it's the first time I've ever heard of it. So it's a fresh watch for me as well. Me and the wife sat and watched it and enjoyed it thoroughly, to be honest, which I wasn't expecting from the wife's point of view, because I didn't really think it's going to be her kind of thing. But she was sort of milling around in the background, and she was listening to the first sort of 10 or 15 minutes, and then she just came and joined me because she said it sounded interesting. So, like I said, it's first watch. I was quite excited to see Dr. Cox from Scrubs in it. And
McGinley was a regular in Stone's films, wasn't he? In this
yeah.
period? I think up till was it Born on the 4th of July, and then he broke off from Stone. Sorry, Mark.
No, that's fine. But yeah, fresh watch for me. I mean, the wife asked me who she'd seen, the main character in, Eric Bogosian, and I got confused and said he was the main actor from Short Circuit.
Gutenberg.
Yes, I thought it was it. She was like, "Who is that?" And I'm like, "That's the guy from Short Circuit, isn't it, Steve Gutenberg?" And then I looked at him. Oh no, it's not.
I thought you were going to say the villain in Under Siege 2, which is it's other big screen credits against Steven Seagal, and I'm doing the Steven Seagal, martial artsy movements as we talk, but you can't see it. Anyway, so it has to be done when you mention Steven Seagal. You have to move your arms like a mad thing. So, in terms of my first encounters, I think I seem to recall seeing this on VHS first. And I think I picked it up at I was a big fan of Stone's work, like yourself, AD, at the time. And I picked this up. It would have been sort of around about 1991, around about sort of after The Doors, Born on the 4th of July. And I picked this up on VHS. It was the big box rental VHS, which you might not remember, Mark, being much younger than myself.
I remember VHS.
Do you remember that rental VHSs were in larger boxes, weren't they?
Yeah, I had tapes. You know what I mean?
I was thinking he's about 15. All just
discs and clouds when I was a lad.
And then I watched it then, and then rewatched it again it was shown on Moviedrome in 1994, which might have been when you saw it, AD, perhaps.
Possibly, yeah.
And that was 4 then.
Yeah. Oh, I feel old. That was the fag end, I think, the Alex Cox era, and Cox delivered a typical Alex Cox intro, delivering a rant against limousine liberals in Hollywood who don't quite understand. It's a weird introduction. I rewatched it recently, and I've got the Moviedrome books and read it, and I'm still not quite sure whether Cox is labelling Stone one of these limousine liberals, or is labelling the sort of the Hollywood types that don't get Stone's work. I don't quite get it. But it's got a lovely line about Kent, character played by Michael Wincott, who we'll probably talk about later, the stoner that comes on and much to the chagrin of everybody else, Champlain sort of invites him into the studio. And Cox refers to Kent, and he's referencing some of Stone's previous work as well, particularly Salvador, which I think is an amazing film. But he refers to Kent as Cox, as a true freak, I'm quoting, on a par with the Salvadorian death squad leader in Salvador or the Brugelian conspirators in JFK. You rarely feel the director's sense of power that creatures such as Kent exist, which they do in profusion. It's a wonderful description of Kent. And Cox also suggested that the film was prophetic in the years since its release. He talks about Rush Limbaugh and Howard Stern becoming popular, but I'm sure even when I watched that in '94, I'm sure Stern was a thing pre-talk radio, wasn't it? Stern's radio show. I'm sure Stern was one of those sort of talk radio hosts that existed before the film was made. But anyway,
I'm fairly sure it was a bit earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean there was the other film that this sometimes crosses over with is Private Parts, isn't it? The Stern biopic that came out in was that mid to late 90s, 97, something like that.
I thought you were going to say Good Morning Vietnam then.
Oh well, there's Good Morning Vietnam, which is a damn good film. Barry Levinson's Good Morning Vietnam with Robin Williams. I'm a big fan of that one actually. I do like that.
It was 97 Private Parts.
Yeah, 97. I thought it was. Yeah. Good Morning Vietnam. There's a clear sort of parallels, I think, with that actually. I'd forgotten about that for some reason. I've not seen that in years. Need to rewatch that. So in terms of contemporary reviews, did anybody dig up anything about those?
Just to a quick. You brought up Howard Stern, and according to that bastion of research, Wikipedia, he began a 20-year run at WXRK in 1985. Had been doing DJing from 76 to 82, from 76 onwards. So he was pre this, obviously.
Yeah. Around about the time that Bogosian wrote the play, 85 actually. So certainly pre the film. Play. Did anybody find any contemporary reviews or anything particularly interesting in any contemporary reviews?
Contemporary, no. I had a look round. I couldn't really find much. I could find stuff from around the time, and you go looking for these things, and a lot of the links are now dead. So that doesn't really help, sort of thing. So I've just gone to our usual bastion of Metacritic.
Yeah, that's
which
fine.
is always good. Roger Ebert really liked it.
Yes, he did. Yeah,
10 out of 10. Praising the virtuoso, unsettling closing monologue, in which we think the camera is circling Bogosian, and we'll talk about that a bit later, sort of thing. But yeah, it's got a, I think it sort of falls down. There's positives and negatives reviews is what I found. I mean, it's got an average of 66 if you're talking averages, which don't always tell the full story, do they? No. No, it was a bit tricky to find anything that was, of anything contemporary. Did you find much?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Chicago Tribune review by Dave Kerr at the time said the film overflows with Stone's personality, both to its credit and its detriment, which I think is quite interesting. Because Stone's I think he's one of those filmmakers that, particularly in that period of his career, probably still today, polarised audiences very much so. And Dave Kerr also says the film is, quote, another electrified existential sounding board for the ills of late 20th century America, which is a good description of Stone's work generally. Kerr goes on to say, quote, as a director, Stone has a way of merging with the point of view of his protagonists, which is to say that his films are as jittery wide up and as fragmented as they are, which kind of goes back to, you mentioned about some of the camera work, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But Kerr also says there's no contemplative distance in Stone's work, no guiding structure, and little real analysis, which is sort of a backhanded form of praise in a way, because he lets the characters speak for themselves in some ways. And I think particularly with this picture, you get a character, the Champlain character, that's presented warts and all, and he's very three-dimensional and rounded because of that. Because he's quite unpleasant in some ways, but he's quite sympathetic in others.
There's a good from Empire. Mark Cooper's reviewing Empire. There's a bit on Metacritic. There's a good line here where he says a riveting portrait of a complex man who, like Stone himself, struggles with being a favourite of the institutions he attempts to rebel against. I think that's that's pretty, pretty on the nose, I think. Actually,
it is. It's good. Yeah.
I've got that line written down as well.
Yeah. I mean, the Ebert review emphasised the connection with the Alan Berg story, the story of Alan Berg, which I don't know. Do you know anything about Alan Berg?
I knew that this was based on a DJ that was shot by a listener outside, so I knew there was some kind of parallel with a real life incident sort of thing, but I didn't look too far into it. No.
Yeah, I mean, Berg was a Jewish talk show radio host. He was murdered in 82 or 84. 84, wasn't it? By a neo-Nazi group called the Order, who machine gunned him with a Mac 10. Talk about overkill. I think in his garden, I think, as I recall. The play that Bogosian wrote wasn't written with Berg in mind, but when he rewrote the play for the film script, he revisited the play for the film script. He worked in these references to a book by Stephen Singular, who's a fellow that's written quite a lot of true crime books, called Talk to Death, The Life and Murder of Alan Berg, which was more about the neo-Nazi group, the order that executed or assassinated, murdered Berg, than it was about Berg himself, really. But yeah. I mean, Ebert emphasises that connection with the Alan Berg story, and he says Talk Radio is directed by Stone with a claustrophobic intensity. And we often talk about stagey films, and this is kind of stagey in the sense that there's limited scenes, limited settings, but I don't think it ever feels static. And I think because of some of the things that you were saying, Adi, about the camera work, for instance. And Ebert goes on to say, these days a lot of people are opposed to the newfound popularity of trash television, and no doubt they are right, and the hosts of these shows are shameless controversy mongers, but at least they are not intimidated. And he goes on to ask this question of what use is freedom of speech to those who fear to offend, which is quite an interesting question. It's sort of at the back of my mind, because I don't know if you saw that video essay that I put on the Teams thing about the house with laughing windows, but you know those questions of ethics in art, I think, are something that at the foreground of my mind because of a few journal articles that I'm working on at the moment. In the Los Angeles Times, Michael Wilmington says that Champlain's venom is universal, a rampage on an open mic. There's some mild remnants of 60s era progressive politics in there, anti-war, anti-bigotry, but it's gotten curdled with scorn and laced up with a sour hipster's contempt for soft-minded patsies and squares who won't rise up, which I think is kind of interesting because I think you can see that anti-establishment tone in Champlain's rants and his positions, particularly with relation to Metrowave and sort of the corporate sensibility. But on the other hand, he's very regressive in some instances, and I think that comes back to what we were saying earlier, and we'll come back to later about his hypocrisy as a character, I think. Wilmington says that as a transcription of Bogosian's theatre piece, the play on which it's based, Talk Radio is tense, packed and crackling with life. As a dramatic investigation into Alan Berg and his murder, it's shallow and dubious. But as a synthesis of those two disjointed halves into a volatile whole, a comic paranoid nightmare about media success, media prejudice, and the pathological relationship between performers and their audience, the film is an often dazzling success. And the New York Times review also says that as much as the text is about Barry, it's also about the time that produced him. He's not a mainstream character, but his is the kind of arrogance that convinces frequently mindless listeners that they too ought to be heard, which indeed they can be on Talk Radio. The New York Times review also goes on to criticise the photography, which I think is a bit wrong-headed, because I think the photography is one of the stellar aspects of the picture, really. Referring quite dryly to the 360-degree shot, which we'll probably talk about later, where the set seems to revolve around Barry and the camera. They refer to that as a lazy Susan shot, and that's quotes, which is really sort of mocking quite a bravura moment in the film. They also criticise what they call the spongy flashbacks that were added into the film script that weren't in the play, but we'll talk about those a bit later. I think those are essential, but that's something we'll talk about later. Mark, did you dig up anything that you'd like to sort of mention in the
Yeah, I had a couple. I think I read that same New York Times article that you did by Vincent Canby. He calls it a mess of a movie that comes complete with a conventional beginning, middle, and end, and long, spongy flashbacks. The bit that I found interesting, he said, in addition, they've grafted onto the play elements from the real-life story of Alan Berg, of the Denver show host who was murdered in '84. And I don't know, like all sort of the way. I didn't know anything about Alan Berg before the film, and all sort of the way through. My wife, who watched it with me, she was saying, you know, he's going to die, he's going to end up dead. And I was sort of, you know, well, no, let's just watch it and see. We'll find out. And so I don't know whether if it was that obvious, you know, sort of that his death was coming. Could it be possible that the way that Canby says they've grafted the elements onto the movie is maybe a little bit clumsy, but I don't know. Personally, without knowing the story of Alan Berg beforehand, it did seem like sort of like a natural conclusion. So I'm not sure. I think he's been a bit overly harsh, maybe.
I think so. Yeah, I think it was one of the few negative, sort of mixed negative reviews that.
Yeah, I couldn't find any like really bad ones apart from him. Hal Hinson, he said that Oliver Stone when he's talking about sort of instances of hate speech and bigotry and stuff, he says Oliver Stone strains hard to make his points and in the process distorts and undermines them. Which again, I don't think is probably that true. I think there's a lot of examples and of evidence that kind of anti-Semitism, especially in racism, does exist in America. And is that the sort of way to go regarding combating bigotry and hate speech? Is to show people, how bad it can be. The scene where he gets sent a Nazi flag and a dead rat in a shoebox. It may seem like it's a bit shoved down the viewer's throat, but things like that have happened and do happen. So,
well, I mean, I'll be honest. That story about the dead rat in the shoebox, when I revisited the film in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, struck a chord with me because I had a friend that used to work in the job centre. And they used to get quite a lot of threatening phone calls. And there was an incident where he was in the office, on the front line, the sort of the desks. I mean, people come in and urinate up the screen.
The job trenches.
Yeah, and he was on the front lines there, and there was a phone call saying there's a bomb, and it was a shoebox, and when it was opened up, there was a dead rat inside, which you kind of, and that was a true story. Something happened to a friend of mine, sort of around about, it'd been 99, 2000, 2001, something like that. Yeah. And whether the person that did that was inspired by talk radio, I don't quite know. But I hope it wasn't. I hope it wasn't you, AD, inspired by talk radio.
No.
No, it wasn't.
Not this time. Not on this occasion.
But things like that do happen, and that was sorry, Mark.
No, it's right. I was going to say I found a lot of articles sort of linking the film and the sort of what they call the modern era of Trumpism. With his outspoken rants on Twitter before he was banned from it.
Well, particularly the alt-right thing on Alex Jones. And so on. Who I always get mixed up with Alex Jones on the One Show. I just want to see a story, but
they are easy to confuse, I have to say.
Yes.
One's a very leggy Welsh woman, and the other one's a ranting American. But
well, you say that, but there was a few years ago. There was.
I will not hear disparaging comments about Alex Jones on the One Show.
there was a few years ago. There was the singer of a rock band called Lost Prophets. His name was Ian Watkins, and he was put away for some very horrific crimes. And unfortunately, one of the singers from Steps H, his name is also Ian Watkins, and he got a lot of hate on Twitter. People really coming at him because they kept getting him mixed up with the criminal.
Yeah, that's not
so it just goes to show you how easy it is. In this day and age, and even back then, like it's easier now, I think, to be horrible on the internet to people because they can't get to you. They don't know who you are, where you're from.
Well, we have a word for it, don't we? Trolling these days.
Yeah, and that word came up a lot when I was sort of looking into the film. But in fact, I think someone referred to Champlain as sort of like the ultimate troll because he has his format and he has his spouting point where he can say what he wants, and these people who do call in, they do benefit from anonymity, don't they?
Yes.
I mean, there's a lot of parallels with how it is today. It's just instead of us ringing in and saying it, it's even easier now because we can just type it in on our keyboards or our phones and remain completely anonymous.
I mean, one of the things that I mentioned a bit later in my notes is the cacophony of voices, which is a phrase that I put down, which is you get at the end after Champlain, and nearly called him Berg then, after Champlain is murdered, and then there's a montage, an audio montage, isn't there, of people sort of delivering offhand eulogies, really. Listeners sort of calling in to speak about the memories of him, and it's such an overload of different voices. But a lot of those voices in the film are played by the same actors, aren't they? Playing 2 or 3 parts.
Yeah.
And that's deliberate because you get those voices become confused, and I think that's very, very much the case with the internet, where there's even less personality in someone's words, and you've often only got an avatar, on the screen or whatever, the manner in which different viewpoints can overlap and intersect and become confused and become very, very toxic, I think, as well. I think with the internet, I think sorry, Mark.
The internet today is, personally for me, the Mos Eisley Cantina. It's a hive of scum and villainy.
Yes,
well, is this the point where I get to sort of say what I think is my favourite line from the whole film, when he's doing that monologue at the end?
You're welcome to AD if you want to interject it.
It seems to sort of fit in here, sort of thing. I might have brought it up in the discussion bit where we talk about the talk radio phenomenon and stuff. But it's where he says marvelous technology is at our disposal, and instead of reaching up to new heights, we're going to see how far down we can go, how deep into the muck we can immerse ourselves. And that was the single line from this film, sort of thing that I took away from it. In amongst all the the racism and the anti-Semitism and all that sort of thing, which I thought was a bit sort of typical Stoner negotiation. I thought, and for myself, it's not something I'm hugely aware of. It's not something that's affected my life, so I can only take, I can sort of experience that sort of, from a distance. But that line I thought was particularly prescient of where we find ourselves today, sort of thing, because marvelous technology is at our hands, and the internet was dreamt of, like, to allow all people to do all things, sort of thing, and give freedom of the press, and now look at it.
Yeah. I mean, I many years ago, I applied for a job elsewhere, and I had to do a talk session on Web 2.0 to students, and I was very, very cynical, and I think the people that were observing thought, we don't want him talking about digital culture to students, because I was sort of saying, well, actually, it's just an extension of what the web was for initially, which is an extension of the radio, and it's not anything particularly new. The technology's new, but the how it enables people to articulate themselves and how it brings out the worst in people isn't new. It's just amplified it, hasn't it? It created more outlets for it.
Yeah, I took a similar view, actually, in a very similar situation. I had an interview. Actually, I got the job, though. This was for a teaching post many years ago. And I likened, I just paraphrased Marx's religion is the opiate of the masses. And said that that's been now usurped, and the media is the opiate of the masses.
Exactly.
And they seem to like that. I was like, I don't know. I don't know. But it's
more sympathetic listeners, I think, than I did.
Maybe, yeah. I think they were just impressed that I was like, oh, Marx, this guy knows his stuff.
You got your foot in the door. Mentioned Marx.
Yeah, absolutely. What they didn't know is sort of thing. I just looked on the internet the night before. God bless the internet.
Dangerous. You go one step further, and you mention Bakoonin, and you get a sort of a police escort out the door because they think you're an anarchist.
Oh dear.
Sorry,
no, that's all right. But yeah, I think that's one of the. Obviously, I don't know. That's my Karl Marx anecdote for the week.
And everybody needs one of those.
Everybody should do it.
Couldn't it? Now time for the Karl Marx anecdote of the week.
So in terms of production, did anybody dig up anything about the production? Do you know anything about the production? Or Mark, did you look at anything about the production?
I didn't know, to be honest. I didn't manage to find that much on it. Just sort of like thinking about the how it seems, and it very much looks like, even though it's a film, it does still kind of look like a stage play a little bit, doesn't it? Like you said, with a limited amount of locations and scenes and things, and doesn't it? But
I mean, it's stagey, but I don't think when people use that word stagey to describe a film, they often sort of refer to things that are very static and it's stagey, but in a good way, I think.
Yeah, I know. I don't mean that as a criticism or a negative thing.
No.
I quite enjoyed the fact because it's refreshing to see something that's not been overworked.
Yes, yeah.
And over adapted or overproduced, that kind of thing.
Yeah. It's not a Michael Bay film.
Oh, explosions and giant robot testicles everywhere.
Yeah, I've crossed myself. You know, you can't see me doing it, but I've crossed myself as I mentioned Michael Bay's name.
Yes, we don't have him in this house.
Yeah, well, although I did, before you joined, AD, I did sort of quote a line from The Rock, which I shall not quote, but we were having a conversation.
Yeah.
Mark said he was a bit nervous, but he's going to try his best, and I quoted the line from The Rock that I'm sure will be at the forefront of your mind as well at the present moment.
I don't know what the line was, so I'm trying to think. There's too many good lines in The Rock. There's too many.
The Clement Lefrene style line, which I'm sure was added by them, where Nicolas Cage says, "I'm going to try my best," and Sean.
Oh yes.
Winners always whine about. Losers always whine about their best. Winners go home and do something very different. You know what I mean.
That's the pre-9 o'clock ITV Watershed version.
Yes, yeah. Winners go home and have a cup of tea and a slice of cake.
Before recording, it was the Channel 5 version. Bravo version.
Yeah, Bravo.
The Men in Motors version.
Yeah. Hey, did you think up anything about the production?
Not much, no. I was surprised it actually took just a little bit sort of thing. Filming was over 4 weeks.
25 days, I think, specifically, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah. Which actually, I thought it might have been shorter, actually, because, as we've said, sort of thing, there's, the main bulk of the film is in those two, the opening sequence and the end sequence with those bits in the middle. Apart from that, I couldn't really find much about the sort of making of it. So no, it's not. I mean, what I should say about it is based on the stage play. It keeps its roots within that stage play to, I think, a degree, sort of thing. I don't. Alec Baldwin didn't like working with didn't like working with Oliver Stone.
Called him dictatorial, didn't he?
Yeah, which sounds about right. That's what I'd expect.
Yeah.
So no, you go, Paul, if you've got stuff.
Yeah, I've got some stuff. I was going to say Bogosian had some interesting stuff. I saw an interview with Bogosian in New York Magazine, I think it was at the time. Bogosian had some interesting stories about Stone because he'd sort of heard that Stone was quite fearful to work with, and he was a bit reticent, and he found that it was his worst fears realised because Stone was very demanding of him. And he sort of at one point he told him to redraft the script in quite a short period of time, and Bogosian found that very sort of threatening and intimidating. But in some ways, in those interviews, he said that between the lines he appreciated the challenge, and Stone offered him some advice, which looking at Bogosian's career over the next decade and sort of his appearance in that Steven Seagal film, which I know I quite like it. I quite like Under Siege 2, and I did show it to some students as part of a Steven Seagal season. But it's probably not the best film. But Stone advised Bogosian after making Talk Radio that he could either concentrate on writing or concentrate on acting. To do both was sort of diluting his talent in some ways, and Bogosian carried on the stage, but he did concentrate on taking these kind of roles in films like Under Siege 2 and so, and like the captain in Law and Order: Criminal Intent in the 2000s and so on. But in terms of the play worked, or the premise of it, Bogosian at the time from the 70s was mid to late 70s was a monologuist and sort of. Stand-up comic's probably a too simplistic description of what he did because he was a provocateur really on the stage, like a punk stand-up comic, a bit more like Richard Pryor, I suppose, or somebody like that than like Bernard Manning. Oh, crossed myself when I mentioned Bernard Manning again.
Good lord!
Oh dear me, what a name to mention. I do, but it would be. I'm not going to say anything disparaging about Bernard Manning because
you're going to say Jim Davidson next, and then I'm going to walk off the podcast.
No, I shall refrain. But Bogosian, the premise of the play worked its way into Bogosian's body of work, his stage act in '83. And this was in response to a conversation that Bogosian had with Ted Savinar, the artist who suggested Bogosian play a talk show host on stage and have characters call in from off stage. And this was something that Bogosian started playing with in '83. It evolved over a few years. And the original version of the play, which I've got next to me, I've got a copy of the play next to me. Just for I've not read it for a few years, but the introduction is quite interesting. It's in the Essential Bogosian. The original version of the finished play was performed in Portland, Oregon in '85. But then in '87, there was a performance in New York where the play was extended. And I think the version I've got might be the New York text, but I'm not sure. It ends with that moment in the film before the murder where Stu says to Barry, it's dead air, Bar, and the radio, the mic's empty, isn't it? It's a coal mic, and then it shuffles on to the next program, which is Dr. Susan Fleming, a psychologist, I think, or something like that. Very different to the ending of the play, of course, the film. Sorry, it was revived. The play was revived in 2007 for quite a celebrated one with Liev Schreiber in the lead role, and some snippets of Schreiber playing the Champlain character online, which are quite interesting because he does play him in a slightly different way to Bogosian. And Bogosian at that point had revisited the play script and reworked it slightly for the 21st century. All the references to Alan Berg's murder were appeared when the film was in pre-production. They weren't really about the original play, but they'd been worked in based upon the fact that Edward Pressman, the producer who'd worked with Stone previously on Wall Street and so on, had optioned the play, and he'd also optioned Stephen Singular's book about Alan Berg, Talk to Death, which I mentioned previously, and he asked Stone to serve as put my teeth back in. Stone to serve as the co-producer and help Bogosian work the play script into a feature film script. At the time, Stone wasn't going to direct it. He was deep in other projects. He was actually developing what would become Born on the 4th of July, but the production of that was delayed by a year or two, and Stone kind of slotted himself in as the director of talk radio. But prior to that, other directors had been considered. Pressman was going to produce, Stone was going to co-produce, and they considered Adrian Lyne, Sidney Lumet. Lumet, if you think about Network, would have been quite an interesting choice, I think, for this. William Friedkin was considered. Alan Parker, as well, was considered. Some of these, however, tried to recast the part of Champlain. Pressman insisted that Bogosian played the lead because he'd seen him on stage playing this character. But some of these directors, I'm not sure which one of them insisted that Dustin Hoffman play the part, which maybe that feels like a very Sidney Lumet, Sidney Lumet's talk radio with Dustin Hoffman as Barry Champlain. It's sort of, I can see that. But Bogosian adapted content from the book, of course, which Pressman had optioned, and wrote some new scenes from the film, looking at the failed marriage with Alan Green's character, the pre-radio job in the clothes store, and how Champlain became Barry Champlain, because he changes his name, doesn't he, of course, and becomes the radio shock jock. Also, the sports event and the fans booing Champlain, that was all something that was, I think, quite heavily detailed in this Singular book, which I did read many years ago. Where he turned up to a sports event, I think, and the fans booed him, and he was quite sort of shocked at that. And the final montage of voices as well was something that was added for Champlain after his murder. And these are all sort of aspects of Berg's life story. There had been some other films about Berg's story. Of course, there was Costa Gavras' film Betrayed with Tom Berenger in '88 as well, earlier in the year. And also there's a play by Stephen Dietz, ironically, because Dietz is the representative of the name of the Metro Wave representative in this film, called God's Country in '88. But as I say, when scheduling problems delayed the production of Born on the 4th of July, Stone agreed to direct talk radio. The initial budget, and I couldn't find the actual sort of final budget for the film, but it was under $6 million, and it was shot over 25 days, as you say, AD, as well. So the other thing that the film does is it moves the action to Dallas, which I think is quite interesting, because what you've got in the opening sequence of the film, the title sequence, is those shots of the high rises, isn't it? And I'll come on to a bit later. Maybe we'll talk about this, the way that the studio seems sort of separated from the rest of the world, very impervious. And I think the setting of the high rise sort of emphasises that, I think. How isolated and impervious, like a goldfish bowl, Champlain's recording studio is. But, I mean, what about the personnel? What about Oliver Stone? Adi, you said you were a big fan of Stone's work.
I was around this time. So things like, ironically, the first I became aware of Stone, but unbeknownst to it sort of thing, is Conan the Barbarian, which he wrote the original draft of. Yes. Which I was unaware of at the time, and that was a few years later that I became aware of that, and when reading around that sort of thing, and it was some kind of I remember there was an interview with Milius where he said that he couldn't, it was unfilmable what he'd written, so it had to be toned down sort of thing. So that I'd seen The Hand, the Michael Caine,
the Beast with Five Fingers stories,
horror thing, which was great, but then. I really started to like his work when I watched Salvador, Platoon, Wall Street, and that's why and then Born on the Force and Talk Radio sits right in the middle of that lot, and that's why I'm pretty sure I've seen it. I think it's just overshadowed by. I mean, if we look at the run of films he had at this point, Salvador, Platoon, Wall Street, Talk Radio, Born on the Force, The Doors, JFK, Heaven and Earth, and then Natural Born Killers, Nixon, U-Turn, Any Given Sunday. I mean, as a run of films. That's pretty damn strong.
Astounding, yeah.
And to cover such diverse elements, but as he does sort of thing, and so it was always for me. Oliver Stone was just strap in and sit down and get ready whenever you watched one of his films, because you knew you were going to kind of have this sort of. It was going to be you weren't going to look away from the screen for like 2 to 3 hours or however long he had it sort of thing, because he just seemed to have this command of the screen. It was just and I think Talk Radio. For 2/3 of it has that as well. Yeah. I was a big Oliver Stone fan. And I think that quote from Empire is pretty apt. He always seemed to be railing against the Hollywood establishment, but was sort of, needed its money to produce what he needed, sort of thing. So there's kind of strange dichotomy of you don't want to always constantly biting the hand that feeds him. And you kind of got that when you read any interviews with him, and obviously his experiences in Vietnam would lead to obviously a lot of his views of the establishment and America as a whole. And his films were very challenging. They weren't easy watches for me as a I mean, we've spoken about Simple Plan, we spoke about Sam Raimi. So there was the Sam Raimi sort of goofball stuff on one hand, which I really enjoyed sort of thing, and then on the other was this really hard. For his sort of plus Salvador came out 86, so I was 14, so I probably watched that when I was about 15, 16. This was a different kind of experience for a sort of 15, 16-year-old to be sort of going to watching these films. And so, I think they had a bit of an effect on me. And I think the biggest one was, as much as it's been derided and talked about and, discussed and everything, was JFK. And obviously I think we'll discuss that when we come, maybe Robert Richardson, who did the photography for it. But JFK, for all its faults, is an absolute tour de force. It's an astonishing film because it's incredible. There's a lot. I think actually watching Talk Radio, there's a lot of Talk Radio in JFK and the round table sequences, and Stone's ability to, create really long scenes from just people talking and have you absolutely riveted to your chair is you don't get that from many directors. There are not many directors who can pull that off. And so I've not been, I think after probably Any Given Sunday, I don't think he's done much more that I've watched. I don't think I've seen W. I'm just looking through. So it was that period of time sort of thing where I was a huge fan, and as much as he's got his detractors and he's got his problems, and there's issues around some of his viewpoints. I mean, JFK was heavily criticised for being homophobic and that kind of thing. So he does court these controversies. As a filmmaker, I think he's coming out of the 80s through the 90s sort of thing. He was one of the powerhouses for me. So
Mark, do you have any feelings about Stone's work?
Maybe not necessarily his work, but I don't know a huge deal about the man, to be honest. This is sort of the first contact I've had. Well, I say contact with him. Obviously, I've not met him. I understand, obviously, he was a very prolific and sometimes provocative artist, I suppose. In looking a little bit into him,
sorry to interrupt you, Mark, but I mean, it's hard to. I think you're quite significantly younger than myself and Adi, and I think it's hard to imagine how much of a phenomenon JFK was, particularly. I think,
and Natural Born Killers.
Yeah, Platoon to JFK, Natural Born Killers was obviously at the forefront of conversation for different reasons. I mean, I remember seeing that in the cinema. I mean, I like Natural Born Killers, and I actually saw it in the cinema as a big fan of Stone's work. I saw it at the cinema twice in one day, 3 times. I went to see it.
Good
sorry,
Lord.
Mark, I don't mean to disrupt you, but I went to see it in an afternoon screening, and then because I was doing my A levels at the time, or something like that, and it was cheap in the afternoon, wasn't it? The cinema, if you remember, and I sort of popped down to the pictures to see it, and then in the afternoon, my girlfriend phoned up. She said, "Oh, do you want to go see Natural Born Killers?" And said, "Well, funnily enough, I saw it this afternoon. I didn't think you'd be interested in that." I said, "Sure," and then I went to see it a week later after I digested it a bit. Again in another afternoon screening, because there's so much in that film, and I mean, we talk about Hollywood films and being very choppy, but Natural Born Killers is, but I think there's a purpose to it, and it's sort of satire of the media, and all 3 times that I saw it, there were mass walkouts, and I'm talking like a third to a half of the audience walking out of the film. And I don't think it was because they were offended by the violence. I think they were just confused by the proliferation. Because at that point, post JFK, Stone had worked into his sort of discourse the use of different 16mm and video footage, and I think people just that blew the tiny little minds, and then just stormed out of the cinema en masse.
Yeah, because I think obviously Natural Born Killers was probably expecting was True Romance out at this point. And obviously we'd had Reservoir Dogs as a Tarantino link, so people were expecting a Tarantino film. What they got was an Oliver Stone film.
Yeah. For better or worse, depending on the viewpoint. I like Natural Born Killers, I still do. But I think so I think it's hard to sort of for anybody that wasn't there to sort of to imagine how much of a phenomenon those films were, especially JFK. Sorry, Mark, I interrupted your.
No, it's all right. Obviously, I was born in 1990, so
yeah,
these are all sort of either before or around me being a wee baby, and obviously, I'm not. Well, I wouldn't consider myself a young man, mostly because it hurts to stand up, but it's not something I was exposed to growing up. But one thing I did note, what I found to be ironic, about Stone when I was sort of having a bit of a look into him, was that given the sort of the themes and the subject matter of talk radio being anti-Semitism, and he got into a bit of controversy with making some Holocaust comments.
Yes,
which I found to be a bit ironic, but I don't think I mean, I don't particularly think what he said was meant to be insulting or to anyone's memory or to the event. And in fact, he came out and apologized and did say that obviously the Holocaust was a bad thing. But that just sort of struck me as a little bit ironic and maybe not distasteful, but I don't know, sort of like maybe sort of he'd maybe forgotten that he'd made such a film about how how disgusting anti-Semitism is and racism is. And that thing.
I mean, not to sort of offer condolence for his comments, but it was kind of framed. I think this was about 10 years ago. It was framed in a discussion of foreign policy. I think.
2006 or something.
Yeah, and it's kind of he's a provocateur, a bit like Barry Champlain, I think, and I think sometimes he says these things and doesn't necessarily. There's a part of Stone that sort of pokes, that needles, and it's that response like Champlain, and maybe that's what drew him to the material. Perhaps, I don't know. I mean, I'm speculating. Sorry, Mark.
No, that's all right. Like I said, he's not really a director that I've been exposed to much, to be honest. And I just thought that was an ironic little sort of anecdote, considering the subject matter of the film.
I mean, if you haven't, then I would, if you want a few evenings of entertainment, then go from his run from Salvador to Any Given Sunday. Just work your way through. Just work your way through them, because there's not a bad one there.
Yeah, in order. I think if you watch them in order, there's a cumulative sense of a progression of.
Don't tell me what to do.
You young people, you don't know you're born.
I'm currently rewatching the animated Clone Wars series, and I shall do nothing until it's finished.
Oh, you and your cartoons.
Oh, yeah. I'll just watch JFK again.
I'm trying to gently introduce my 5-year-old into the world of Star Wars, and I thought if I can get him to watch a cartoon of it, then I could jump straight into.
You might enjoy Salvador.
Possibly.
Don't show him Salvador, please.
He might enjoy talk radio. There's no.
What do you think, Paul? What do you think to Oliver Stone?
I'm a big fan of Stone's work. I think, like you say, that run. I mean, his first couple of films were rough. I think it's fair to say, wasn't it? The Hand and Queen of Evil, which was that was released under a different title, wasn't it? In a few places, Seizure. But when you get to Salvador is an incredible film, and I used to show that a lot to students. With the old digital media production degree, because it kind of went down well with the film production students, but it also went down well with the photography students, because of course it's about a photographer, and I think that's amazing. I mean, that's such a powerful film. And it's I don't want to talk too much about sort of controversial figures, but you've got Stone, who's obviously courts controversy, and James Woods, who's kind of James Woods these days, isn't he? He's not an actor, he's a voice. But then you go to Platoon, and Platoon was so, at the time, that was kind of the first wave of, from Apocalypse Now, that sort of first wave of films about the legacy of the Vietnam War. But Platoon felt very authentic, and it was pitched so much based on Stone's own experiences in the war itself. And that's such a powerful film. Wall Street, which, I mean, I love Wall Street. I quite like the sequel, Wall Street, Money Never Sleeps, as well. Talk Radio, Born on the 4th of July. I have a slight aversion to that because of Tom Cruise, but I think it's a great film, great picture. But it's just Tom Cruise. At The Doors, that's a very slick production, I think, The Doors. And then you go to JFK with its mixed media. And, I mean, JFK, I remember seeing that at the cinema. I think that was probably the first Stone film that I saw at the cinema. And that was an incredible experience. I mean, that was such a sort of memorable experience. Heaven and Earth. I quite like Heaven and Earth, Natural Born Killers. I mean, as I say, I saw that in the pictures 3 times. Nixon, I saw at the cinema also. An amazing film. U-Turn. I can't remember if I saw that at the cinema, but I love U-Turn. Any Given Sunday. So that cinema, I think I saw that twice. But from 2000 onwards, Alexander, World Trade Center, W, Wall Street, Money Never Sleeps, Savages. I have seen most of these. Some of them at the cinema, but I just feel like Stone's lost his edge in filmmaking wise, and in some ways the comments that Mark was saying, I think he's sort of trying to, maybe that's got something to do with the financing and not being able to secure financing for, I mean, can you imagine getting a film like Salvador financed these days? I mean, I can't imagine Hemdale, a company like Hemdale, sort of getting it into mainstream cinemas. It was Hemdale, wasn't it? Yeah, that was David Hemmings' production company. And then, you come on to those sort of, it lost his bite in filmmaking terms and sort of makes up for it by controversial comments in the media, perhaps. But there's been an increasing emphasis on documentaries, hasn't there? So, it's more recent work. So, yeah, I mean, I like Stone's work. I feel since 2000, I've become quite alienated, I think, from the films themselves, but also, from some of the comments that he's made, which have been a bit sort of a bit too Barry Champlain-esque. I always get sort of mixed up with the pronunciation of Champlain or Champlain. I get a bit. So pardon me if I do sort of make that mistake.
I think they do in the film as well. If I'm honest.
I was going to say I think they're doing the film, yeah. So I think that's the source of it. But yeah, that's my feelings about Stone's work.
Appearances kind of thing, mightn't it?
Yeah, I said bucket and bouquet. But as you said, Adi, when you think this is sandwiched between Wall Street and Born on the 4th of July, it's kind of it's forgotten about, and I think it's on par with Stone's other work in this period. I think personally, I'll take it over. I mean, as good as Born on the 4th of July is, I'd take it over that any day. I think any day of the week, perhaps. What about Bogosian?
Aside from Under Siege 2 and turning up in what I watched of that, what's that recent? What's this Adam Sandler film? The one that came out on Netflix last year. The one that's sort of an assault on the senses. Uncut Gems.
Do you know? I've not seen that. I didn't know.
I think I got about half of the way through it because you need a break. It's kind of, if you think it's Natural Born Killers. This is hard to watch in a different way. It's just very hard to watch. I think I just needed a break, so I got about halfway through that. But apart from that, and like you said, Under Siege 2. No, I'm not really. I don't know much about Eric Bogosian, I have to say. You watch this and you think, oh, he's going to go on to some interesting stuff, and it doesn't really happen. I don't know. Maybe this wasn't what he wanted to do. I don't know. Maybe he was put off by Stone. I don't know. But I think he's good in this, and obviously it's his forte. But are we talking about his performance? Are we talking about just him as an actor or his performance in the film? Because I think in the film he's good in it for 2/3. Yeah. Which I think is what I'm going to say about the film itself. And I don't think he I don't know, his range seems to be a bit lacking in the sort of more when he's not actually at the microphone. I don't know whether that's purposeful or not. I don't know. I mean, I'm not, he's in Blade Trinity. I don't know.
I know. But it's
Charlie Dangerous Full Throttle.
Yeah. I mean, his career is very patchy, isn't it? I think that's fair to say. I'll come on to that in a moment. I think what you say about he's good when he's at the mic. That's the play. That's kind of the play script, and he'd done that for a couple of years. And then the other stuff, Champlain's sort of background and the scenes when he's away from the studio was what was added for the film script, and maybe that sort of explains that difference in his performance style, perhaps. Mark, are you aware of Bogosian before this, or
loved him in Short Circuit?
Oh yeah, I forgot about the Police Academy films and Cocoon.
Yeah, that was highlight of his career. To be honest, this is the only thing I've seen him in. I think a little bit like AD. I thought his performance when he's Radio Barry is very intense, especially that last sort of monologue. Where he's he's looking at the mic, sort of like he hates it. But with the other scenes, like especially the sort of the flashbacks, and they to me seem a little bit half-hearted, maybe. I think in points it's quite a well-written character, and I don't know. So I think it could be more of a more well-rounded character. But Yeah, I don't know. I have swings and roundabouts sort of for his acting of the character. I was reading a documentary, not a documentary, sorry, an interview that he gave to The Guardian in 2017, and it was about sort of talk radio, and he was talking about his comedy and stuff like that, and how he was sort of a bit inspired by John Belushi when he was thinking about his career and how he wanted to make his audience larger. And there's one sort of line he gave, and he said, what would I be willing to do to get my audience to be larger? I played the Batcave in Soho or Squats in Amsterdam, where I'd be as obnoxious as possible. But I was like, where is this leading? And then when I found Barry, I hit pay dirt. And maybe I'm sort of misconstruing what he's saying, but I don't know. That sounds like someone who maybe wants to be famous for fame's sake. Maybe I don't know if that's a bit too harsh.
I think there's an interesting, because Bogosian said about the play that it was in some respects, or rather than film, that in some respects it was semi-autobiographical, because it was a point in his life where before that he'd been a monolinguist. And, like I say, a stand-up comic, but more of a performance artist, and very punk rock stand-up comic. I mean, he developed this character, Ricky, what was his name? I can't remember his name. Ricky Paul, in the 70s. It was a sort of I mentioned Bernard Manning previously, and it was a bit of a joke, but it sort of ties in here, because the Ricky Paul persona that Bogosian had developed was very deliberately provocative. He's sort of racist. He would sort of throw out racist, sexist jokes, a bit like Alexei Sales, the world's worst warm-up man. What was his name? AD. What was the name of that character? Harry Diddlin. Was that another Barry? But yeah,
I honestly can't remember.
There was a period in the 90s where sort of progressive comics had they referenced these sort of working men's club type comics in Britain.
There was John Thompson's Bernard Wright on.
Exactly, yeah, and
One I remember.
Stuart Lee kind of does that in his act sometimes, but Bogosian developed this Ricky Paul character. It was kind of a racist, sexist comedian, and he played in these clubs in New York, very sort of liberal and progressive, and deliberately provoked confrontation with audiences. It was more than stand-up comic. It was more like punk theatre, and you get that in Champlain, and I think that's quite sort of evident in Champlain. And then Hollywood called with the making of this film, and Bogosian had acted previously in small roles. I mean, go back to Larry Cohen, but he was in The Stuff, very very small role in Larry Cohen's The Stuff, and he also played a more significant role in Cohen's special effects against Zoe Tamlis or Zoe Lund as a bad guy in that picture. And with talk radio in '88, there was this kind of point where Hollywood was beckoning, and he was neglecting his family. I watched an interview with Bogosian from 2007, the Charlie Rose interview, where he sort of says, at that point he felt like he was neglecting his family to sort of take up the opportunities that Hollywood was presenting to him, and this tension between family and advancing his career. And we see that, I think, in the script, which is kind of going back to what you were saying, Mark. I think, at that point in his life, Bogosian was kind of experiencing that. And Stone also advised Bogosian when making Top Radio that he could either write or act. He couldn't define the time between both of these endeavours. And he sort of threw himself into quite a lot of acting work in the 90s, Under Siege 2, of course. But Dolores Claiborne, I'd always forgotten. I always forget that he's in Dolores Claiborne too. He appeared in sort of TV shows, Larry Sanders Show. It was in Woody Allen's Deconstructing Harry, and so on and so forth. So I think you get this aspect of Champlain's character, torn between family and work and sort of advancing his career is evident. It comes from Bogosian's self, and there's that great moment in the film, isn't there, which is something that's not in the script, where in one of the flashbacks, Champlain says to his wife, she says, what about he asked her to act as his producer, as he's becoming known, as he's acquiring this radio show for himself, his solo radio show in the flashback, and his wife says, "What about our marriage?" And he says, "Fuck our marriage," doesn't he? He says, I mean, it's really, really an unpleasant moment. And Ellen Green is so sweet in the film that you feel her pain. But he says, I'm trying to find the proper quote. He says, "Fuck our marriage." He says, "What, I want this to be the best show," or something along those lines, doesn't he? I've got to develop this into the best show that it can be. And I think there's a sense there. Bogosian suggested this Charlie Rose interview from 2007. There's a sense that some of that was sort of semi-autobiographical, if you like. It came from Bogosian's own sort of feelings about his relationship with his wife and so on at that time, and the tension that was brought by the call from Hollywood, if you like. Sorry, Mark, I interrupted you mid-flow, went on a massive sidebar.
That's all right. The only other thing I sort of wanted to say was one thing that always sort of got me about his performance as Barry was just the sort of the way he looked at people. I thought a lot of his acting, maybe sort of came sometimes not from what he was saying, but sort of when he was not talking. Like the lasting impression of me, for me, feels like Barry Champlain was a zoo animal. He's always in that room where people are stood at different windows and they're always staring at him, wanting him to perform. And there's a lot of times where he's looking out and he's not really doing anything. He's just staring at the people who are staring back at him. Like you mentioned earlier that he's a bit like a goldfish in a bowl. For me, he was more sort of like a caged lion. And I don't know, his performance sort of really put that across to me, where he was starting to realise that, and maybe that's why he was sort of riling up people so much that, I don't know, maybe he wanted to be assassinated at the end. Spoiler alert if no one's seen it. But yeah, just those sort of like little glances at people. Like the scene where he's opening the shoebox when it's supposed to be a bomb.
Yeah.
And the way he's looking at people while he's doing it, and it's sort of like, like I said, he's like a lion in a cage, isn't he? That's just at any moment he's just waiting to snap at these people who are staring at him.
Yeah, there's definitely a self-destructive path, isn't there, that he's on? Yeah. And you get that from that moment when he's opening that box, and you don't know if it's a bomb. And Dan's Baldwin's convinced it's a bomb. Laura is, Stu is, and he opens it up and it's a dead rat. But I think Champlain at that point evidences his self-destructive sort of aspect, almost inviting his own demise, if you like. What about something
said earlier about it's an Obi-Wan Kenobi style death, isn't it? Where he says to Vader, "Strike me down now, and I should be more powerful than you can ever imagine." And that's sort of evidenced a bit in his death scene, isn't it? Where the screen goes white as if he's the Messiah and stuff, and it looks up at that antenna, and then you hear all these people's voices sort of lamenting his death.
Exactly. Yeah. In Legacy, his kind of voice acquires a greater potency, you might say. Yeah, I agree fully, Mark. Yeah. What about the other cast members? I mean, we've got McGinley, who worked frequently with Stone in this aspect, this sort of era of his career. Alec Baldwin. I have to admit that I always get the Baldwins mixed up.
There's too many Baldwins.
There's too many Baldwins. Other than Stephen, I can recognise Stephen, but Alec and Daniel and William, I always get those mixed up.
Unbelievably, Alec's the one I always recognise.
There's John Pankow, of course, or Pankow, who I always associate with his role in Friedkin's To Live and Die in LA, which is around about the same era. Michael Wincott, Wincott, who I mostly remember from his name. I know he'd been acting for a long time prior to this, but his name became sort of memorable to me from The Crow, particularly where he plays the chief antagonist. Yeah. And I think Wincott's great in this as the stoner Kent. You know,
the Axl Rose type.
Yeah, I mean Ellen Green. I think she's great as Ellen, Barry's ex-wife. I mean, you know, such a sort of a warm personality. I think Leslie Hope as well. Leslie Hope's a bit bland. I think, a performance, I would say.
Is Leslie Hope the producer, his girlfriend?
Laura.
Yeah. She's. Yeah. I think she's there to fill a hole, fill a role.
Yeah,
she's doesn't really have much of a part, does she?
I don't think the film would suffer without her.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. It's the problem I had with the film sort of thing. Is the film is and I think we seem to be in agreement with this sort of thing. The film is at its strongest, you know, and I would have just preferred maybe 3 nights of him at the radio, rather than that middle section where it's that there's enough inference and stuff. You know, when he rings Ellen, and she comes, and I think, you know, there's enough in that sequence where he rings the sort of thing, and he manipulates her into coming.
He says, you know, I need you here. You know,
yeah, and there's that moment sort of thing where it's focusing all on him, and he stops talking because when he does that. Oh, well, you know, if you can't make it, then, and he's got that look on his face, going, I know exactly how to play this woman to get her to do what I want. Yeah, and that's what his face does. That's a really, really good, you know, it's a really good piece of acting that Bogosian does there, sort of thing, because you can just you see exactly what he's doing, you know, gaslighting or whatever you want to call it, sort of thing. But it's just manipulating her into doing what he wants. Yeah, and I would have preferred if she'd have just turned up and just been like Monday night and Tuesday night, and because at the moment it's just Friday night and Monday night, isn't it? The film centers over.
Yeah,
that weekend space where he goes to the game. You know, we get the impression that most people who call him don't like him. We get that it doesn't introduce anything to the film in that way, sort of thing. And I would have preferred if they'd have just stuck with that and told the story through the interactions he has with the characters in that radio station. That would have been a better film for me, I think. But
I could see that. The story about the game was kind of taken from Singular's book about Alan Berg. It does feel crowbarred in. You know, he goes to that game.
Yeah. I remember watching that scene, and when it was finished, I just thought, what was the point of that?
Yeah. The flashbacks I'll come back to a bit later, I think. But, you know, there's a scene where he's booed by the crowd. I think he realises at that point that who he thinks he isn't who people take it, that he's kind of the villain that they boo at, perhaps. And he's introduced as the man you all love to hate, isn't he, of course, at that point. There are 2 things about the is it baseball or football game? I can't remember which.
Basketball.
But, is it basketball?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's basketball. Yeah, it's a basketball court.
It's one of those American sports. That sounds awfully derogatory, but anyway. But there's the thing I like about that is that moment where Anna Thompson. We mentioned Chura Mance earlier, but Anna Thompson turns up, and the Crow, of course. She's in the Crow, isn't she, as Darla? But she turns up in that wonderful Marilyn Monroe way that she has in those films. If you remember, Chura Mance, she's the girl that tries to. She comes on to Christian Slater in the bar at the start, and they're talking about Elvis. You know, she approaches Champlain and she's laughing riotously, doesn't she? She says he should be ashamed, and she throws a drink into his face. And I think that the game sequence doesn't quite work, but I love that moment from Thompson. The other thing from the game sequence that I take is the fact that Rocket's Red Glare is there, isn't he? And he's the guy that assassinates Champlain at the end, and we don't quite know whether he's Chet. This is the neo-Nazi that's been phoning up, or whether it's some other neo-Nazi or whatever. The thing about Singular's book is that, like I say, it focuses more on the Order, the neo-Nazi group, than it does on Singular. And there were so many members of this, it was like a network, that you kind of, at the end of the picture, you don't know whether the guy that kills Champlain is Chet, or whether he's just another neo-Nazi that's been inspired by, you know, the Order's comments or whatever. But Rocket's Red Glare is there at the game, and he's the one that asks Champlain for his autograph, isn't he?
Yeah, you can tell he doesn't want it though, can't you? Because just because of the way it's hit him, especially like when he's walking away, he's just got that like snarl on his face, hasn't he?
Exactly. Yeah. But
I think he's just sort of trying to prove how easy it is to get close to him, maybe.
Yeah, just testing how sort of secure he is, perhaps. Yeah. I think that's a good point. But yeah, I mean, what about Stuart Copeland's score? I mean, I think of Stuart Copeland. I mean, obviously Stuart Copeland of the Police, Stuart Copeland.
Yeah,
but I think of Stuart Copeland from this era. I think of The Equalizer. And sorry, Adi.
So I was going to say, the Equalizer is for me what I associate him with. But looking through his his filmography as a composer, he did the Spyro games. Which I was like, when I looked at it, I went, hey, Stuart Copeland, he did all three. He did all the Spyro games. So he did Spyro the Dragon, Spyro 2. Just to sort of take this into a video game era into a way. But I was like,
I was going to say, I've just noted the heightened excitement in your voice for the first time.
I was like, wow. I was like, finally, I can shoehorn video games into this.
And now for the next hour, we talk about the Police and Spyro.
The Equalizer, Talk Radio to Spyro. That's a weird. And then right next to Spyro, he does Very Bad Things. There's a double bill. There's a mindset to get into. Stuart Copeland, obviously Police, but it's very certainly his work on The Equalizer was what I knew him from for composing wise. I also know he did See No Evil, Hear No Evil as well.
I was just looking at that, and I didn't realise that he'd written the score for that, to be honest.
And Wall Street as well.
Yeah. I was quite surprised at that, actually, because I think I watched Talk Radio, and the score reminds me of the score for The Equalizer, but I didn't think, I'd forgotten that he'd written the score for Wall Street, which I think, I've not watched it for a while, but it's tonally, I think it's quite different, the music for that, I think, as I recall. My memory could be sort of failing me, but nevertheless. What about Robert Richardson?
Where do you start?
Never met him.
I think his collaborations with Stones started on Salvador, didn't they?
Yes, looking at this, yeah.
He shot Platoon, Wall Street, Talk Radio, Born on the 4th of July, The Doors, JFK, Heaven and Earth, Natural Born Killers, Nixon. U-Turn. I think U-Turn's got his problems on the narrative level, but I think the photography is amazing. And I think that was it, wasn't it? I think he Any Given Sunday, I can't remember who shot that, but then Richardson started working with Tarantino, didn't he, on Kill Bill and so on.
Yeah, worked with Scorsese on Shutter Island.
Yeah.
Wag the Dog, that was another interesting one.
Yeah.
I mean, he did obviously worked with Scorsese on Casino as well. Did A Few Good Men as well. This is quite the resume.
I mean, it's incredible, isn't it, really? When you look at the films that he's shot, and I think Talk Radio, again, is one of those that's sort of overlooked, but it's at the front end of his career, isn't it, in the first 10 years of it, let's say. I think some of the photography is incredible, isn't it? I think.
I tell you what, I really did like. I really liked the sort of split deep focus stuff going on when it's Bogosian taking up. Yeah, when it's Bogosian taking up like half the screen, really close up, and then in the background there's usually it's Alec Baldwin or McGinley or someone just watching him. And I think that
just throwing their arms in the air in exasperation out there.
Yeah. And they're always behind the glass as well, which kind of separates him from them. And Richardson's shooting that with a sort of a portrait lens or something similar, and you've got that split diopter which gives you the foreground and the background in focus. And you get Champlain's sort of behaviour and his deliberate sort of provocation with Laura, Stu or Dan, and they look back from the booth, don't they, silently, and as you say, Mark, you get the sense of them throwing their hands up in the air. I mean, you mentioned Frasier earlier. I think that was before we started recording, but Roz with Frasier.
Better not be. I was planning that for ages.
But you get, it's comical in there, isn't it? But Roz with Frasier, when he says stuff and you can see it going, oh, shut up,
Or she knocks on the glass and all that.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think so much of that is carried by the photography and the staging staging in depth to achieve that. The set is separated from the others by the glass, and there are some wonderful shots, I think, where you see them in the glass, but you also see Champlain reflected in the glass. So you see his head in the foreground, and you see him reflected in the glass, and them sort of reacting to what he's saying over that reflection.
Yeah, it's almost sort of Attenborough-esque in a way, isn't it? Like if we go back to the facts, of him being sort of like maybe sort of like a caged animal. It's sort of it's like he's being shot and recorded in a nature documentary, isn't it? Like this is this animal that we're watching in his natural environment, and you can see sort of towards the end of the film, he goes from being the lion to the antelope being surrounded by hyenas, doesn't he?
Yeah, I like that. That analogy works very well, I think. That works very well. Because there's a lot of, I mean, we're getting onto the analysis now, I think, but there's a lot of, it's about territory, isn't it, in some respects? It's about Champlain's sort of perception of the studio space as his territory, dominated by his ego, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that ties in with, when he gets the news of going national, and he switches from being obviously, the big fish in the small pond to being as you say, that sort of more, smaller fish in a much bigger pond, and I think that freaks him out completely. And going from that, the one with the power to maybe realizing actually I'm not the one with the power. And I think his interactions with his growing sort of frictional interactions with the Alec Baldwin character, his boss, throughout the film, undermine his belief in what he is and what power he actually wields. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, because particularly there's that sort of moment where Dietz, the Metro Wave rep played by John Pankow, is listening to the recording, and Champlain says, he's going to come in here tomorrow and do the same show I always do, isn't there? And there's that sort of sense of him kicking against the pricks there. And when he's told that Night Talk won't be going national on Monday, it's delayed, he launches into a rant. He says, Night Talk still has a standard, a purpose to which it must rise. The show is about saying what needs to be said. But really, what does he say? I think that's the question that I have to ask. I mean, he's got this anti-corporate, anti-big business stance, which is mirrored in Kent a bit later on, and I think Champlain sees Kent as the dark mirror of himself, because he expresses similar viewpoints, but with similar emptiness, but really, Champlain's sense of self-importance. He says this show's about saying what needs to be said, but what is it that he's saying? I don't know if any of you have any feelings about that. What is the point of Barry?
It's the whole general. For me, it's like that everyone in America seems to think that they have a voice that needs to be heard, and there's that little pairing of words that comes up constantly, not only in the show but in reality as well, and it annoys me so much. And it's the use of the two words "this country" over and over and over again, like everyone's an expert. It's just yet another platform of people moaning about what's wrong with this country, and ringing up and talking about the kids on the crack and all this kind of stuff. And everyone thinks they've got something really important to say, but really it's just repetition, isn't it? It's just constant repetition. This is what's wrong with this country, and it's just it infuriates me, and it's still repeated today. We're talking about 1988. This film came out, and it's exactly the same today, is it?
Sorry, Eddie, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say sort of thing. My take on him sort of thing was that Champlain is a relatively empty character. And he needs, if you think about what he's saying, sort of thing, he needs the words of others to fill him up and give him purpose. And so that's, from there's the very first near the very beginning sort of thing, he has a sort of interaction, a sort of quite heated interaction with John T. McGinley's character, where he's like, "Are you feeding me rubbish? Give me better stuff. Give me stuff I can use," because he doesn't have anything of his own to say. He's kind of reactionary, and by the end of it, obviously that changes slightly, but for the most part, this feels like a person who is, we see this through the film sort of thing. He just wants to use people to get what he can get. There's nothing actually to him. There's a bit in the one of the more interesting bits in the bit in the basketball arena where the woman says, "Oh, we will hate you" and stuff like that, and he's going like, "You need me. You need me in your life. You're listening to stuff." And to me, that was like him. They're a sort of parasitical, symbiotic relationship between him and his audience. The audience need him as much as he needs them, and he has nothing. As you were saying, what is he saying? He's not saying anything, because unless he gets someone interesting on to say something to, or to then give him the platform to say something, he doesn't have anything to say until the big old rant at the end, sort of thing, where it all breaks apart. He's almost like an empty vessel. It's what I got from his character. He's devoid of any kind of real feeling or sentiment towards anybody. He has no emotional connection with people. He just is a manipulative person who just wants other people to feed his ego and to feed his need to be listened to, but really it's just all vapid air.
Yeah,
that's what I mean.
He expresses opinions that are all over the political spectrum as well, doesn't he? He's neither left nor right. He's a provocateur. Bogosian's admitted that in that Charlie Rose interview that I said, that I mentioned earlier from 2007. He says that, Champlain's kind of got what you said, Adi. There's no core sense of what he's trying to express. He's got no core self. He's an actor. His intention is to provoke or react to his audience. Therefore, his rantings are inconsistent. At the start of the film, you mentioned the the monologue at the end where it falls apart, but that's intimated at the start, isn't it? I think, where he opens with that rant about media priorities. And he talks about that survey about people's sexual habits taking priority over the murder of an 83-year-old woman, and he says, quote, "We live in a country where culture means pornography and slasher movies, where ethics means payoffs, graft and insider trading. But rarely, as we see later, Champlin is as guilty of exploiting this as anybody else." And there's that wonderful line where Dan says to him, and I identify with a Baldwin at this moment in my life, which is a bit odd. But it says, "What do you think you're doing here, Barry? Changing the world?" He says, "This is a talk show, Barry, and you are a talk show host." And it's kind of, I think, for the audience, you become so wrapped up in Champlain's worldview that you sometimes forget that, as he does.
I struggle with Alec Baldwin. I do.
Yeah, Baldwin. I get them confused, and
I don't dislike Alec Baldwin, but I'm very aware when I'm watching him that he's Alec Baldwin.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It sounds like I'll be watching him in anything, like his little. His cameo in Friends, he did that time, or any other film he's in. And every time he opens his mouth or is on screen, all I'll be thinking is, that's Alec Baldwin.
Yeah.
And it takes over everything. So I can't watch him because it's just Alec Baldwin, isn't it? I'm sure he's lovely. I'm sure he's a nice man. But I don't know. I'm very distracted by the fact that he's Alec Baldwin.
It's not very chameleon-like, I don't think.
No, exactly. He's Alec Baldwin in everything, isn't he? It's one of that's one of the things I don't like about certain actors is they just play themselves in everything they're in, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, Bogosian in that Charlie Rose interview I mentioned previously as well said that he suggested, and I'm quoting here, maybe it's not really about talk radio at all. It's about the personality that's attracted to audiences. And is willing to do anything to get those ratings. Specifically, Bogosian said that he was inspired to write the play originally by John Belushi, seeing Belushi as a character that had been, quote, used up and, quote, abuses himself with an endless need of approval of the audience and willing to do anything to get it, which kind of, I think, contextualises some of what you said, AD, about this. You sort of suggested, I don't think you used the word approval, but you suggested that Champlain was a character that was seeking the approval of the gratification of his audience agreeing with him fundamentally, or seeing him as some sort of authority. But I mean, the Night Talk theme is Thorogood's Bad to the Bone, isn't it? And you get the sense that that's how Champlain sees himself, and the connotations of that music, quite a sort of aggressive, very sort of dominating sound. That's how Champlain sees himself, and I think as well we go back to that moment, which is show-stopping, which is kind of one of these moments that the New York Times review criticised, where the camera rotates 360 degrees around, and then all of a sudden you realise that Champlain is rotating, and of course Bogosian's on some sort of platform with a mic, and it appears that the studio's rotating around him. I think that is a moment that speaks very much of both his isolation from his surroundings. It separates him from his surroundings visually, but also his narcissism as a character. I don't know what you feel about that shot, Mark. Did it impress you in any way, or?
It interested me. I don't think the mechanics of it impressed me, but I definitely found it very interesting because one thing that I noticed throughout the entirety of the film is that in the sort of the sound recording, whenever Barry is talking into a mic, his voice sounds a little bit different. It's a lot clearer, isn't it? Which is something I quite admired.
Yeah, and he's got this habit of looking at the mic, isn't he, as well, as if he's speaking to the mic, rather to the people as well, which I think is quite interesting.
But with
Sorry.
No, right. With that sort of circular spinning shot, it's like I say, I admire it in a way because it's it's very interesting because it's like you say, it's very narcissistic. He's the center of that universe, isn't he? Everything's revolving around him rather than rather than the show being the center. It's him, isn't it? He's the center of the universe. Everything's revolving around him. But in that scene, sort of, it could be a little bit on the nose to say that it maybe represents a sort of slight descent into depression or into madness.
Yeah,
literally everything's spiraling out of control for him. Mentally. What I get
a visual metaphor. Yeah.
You what? Sorry. A
visual metaphor. Yeah. So
what I get from that scene though is that he's talking to himself rather than listeners. When he goes on this big triad of saying that he despises them all, and that he's probably forgotten that he's on a radio show maybe, and he's more talking to himself because he's finally admitted to himself that he is basically useless, isn't he? Like all these there's a quote I've got in front of me from an interview he gave with The Guardian, and he said that there's never really any dialogue on talk radio. It's about turning issues into cannon fodder for entertainment.
Yeah,
it's exactly how we've inherited this moron who is now our president, and that's really a dangerous thing, isn't it? Because to give people a platform to express views they hold that could be quite harmful, it validates those views to the person who's expressing them. And so not only is what he's doing on radio useless, because he's not really aiding anything, is he? He's also helping people to become maybe more radicalized. Yeah, so for me, he's finally probably realised that, and he's finally admitting to the fact that he really does probably hate himself as a person. And even though throughout the film I dislike him because he's an annoying little, so and so, at this point I start to feel sorry for him. It's because it seems like everything is spiraling out of control for him.
Yeah,
especially in his mental health maybe is taking a downturn.
Yeah, I mean, it's at that point where he has that epiphany, doesn't he? Which I think is the film's final epiphany, really, the monologue that he delivers. He says, I'm a hypocrite. I ask for sincerity and I lie. I denounce the system and I embrace it. I want money and power and prestige. I want ratings and success. I don't give a damn about you or the world. That's the truth. And you've got, I think, in those callers, you've got voices that people that are quite clearly very vulnerable, that need some sort of help, and he mocks them. He gives them abuse. You've got people that are quite clearly unbalanced and need much more orchestrated, organised support. And he antagonises them and probably provokes them into sort of making their quite unbalanced view of the world more disturbed. And there's that point, as I say, I come back to that phrase in my notes, the cacophony of voices. And Bogosian says, I mean, as he introduces Night Talk, I think it's the first introduction, he says talk radio, it's the last neighbourhood in town. People don't just talk to each other anymore. And you've got this era in which communication is superficial or non-existent or very, very toxic. And, you have to think, and it's something that I come back to time and time again, because my wife being a primary school teacher and very much foreground in sort of getting kids to talk through the feelings about stuff at the moment, especially in the current context of the pandemic. But we often have this conversation at home that she and I are of a similar perspective. And I say this as somebody that's sort of, had, and I'm quite open about it, but somebody that's I've been on medication for depression and anxiety for different periods of my life. We often say, does talking actually help, or does it sort of escalate some of the problems that you might neglect or sideline? I mean, that's a rhetorical question. And we live in a society and a culture in an era where there's this kind of unquestioned assumption that talking about problems helps. But, I know my wife and I are of a similar perspective. Both of us dealing with this in our day jobs and myself having sort of, discussed this as part of my own sort of, circumstances, is that sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes talking about your problems simply allows them to escalate, perhaps. And I think you see that with Champlain and some of the callers that call in, that talking about them in the wrong context, particularly here, but talking about some of their theories or some of their ways of looking at the world is actually quite sort of harmful to them and to him, perhaps, as well.
Yeah. But especially since mental health is something that's, for a long while been something that's stigmatized, hasn't it? And
exactly, yeah.
Down on, especially when you look at, the sort of the mental institutions of America, as famed in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or Metallica's Welcome Home from the Master of Puppets album. It was a horrible system, and it's only sort of recently across the world that mental health issues are starting to be normalised, aren't they? And I think talking about your problems, like you said, I think it's a very individual thing. Like my wife is, she's a very staunch supporter of therapy and counselling, and she studied it at the university for a while. Whereas me, I've sort of been in and out of counselling and therapy all my life, and I'm when it comes to that thing, I'm not a talker. I don't like it, and I think it's a very individual thing, isn't it?
Exactly,
Which, so in the film, when people, they do ring up and they're having issues and they're talking like that, to be shot down and ridiculed and just plain put off, just hanging when it's like when Baldwin says, I can't say his character's name, it's Alec Baldwin, when Baldwin says, it's your job to hang up on people. It's if you think about it, it's a disgusting thing to do, isn't it? When people are ringing up with problems, like when Kent rings up and he says about his girlfriend's not breathing. The first time, you can kind of see it's a bit of a hoax, especially the second time. But you have no idea if that's real or not, do you? I suppose.
Yeah.
And sort of that disdain of mental health issues, especially in America and especially back then. It's sort of rife in the film, isn't it, a bit with the way he talks to some of his callers.
Yeah. I mean, Laura says to one point, the Leslie Hope's character says, all you have to do is just be nice. And Champlain says to her, you're nice, Laura, it's what you're good at. But he does, there are a couple of instances where he does show good humour. There's a point where Debbie, a clearly lonely caller, and I think that's Anna Thompson, playing that character, but it causes us to laugh, and we sort of see glimpses of a different side of Champlain there. But then there's another point where towards the end of the film, it's got a caller that calls in. She says she's been listening to him for 5 years, and all he can do is mock her. He says she only listens,
doesn't he?
Yeah, he says she only listens to feel superior to the other losers who call in. And at one point, Champlain says, there's nothing more boring than people who love you, and that, I think that's quite insightful to the character. And there's another point as well which I think, rewatching it recently for this. Struck me is the pause after this when there's a chap. Is it a chap that calls in? He says, do you not love yourself, Barry? I think you're very lonely, Barry.
It's a woman, isn't it? She has that very silky voice, doesn't she? Like Miss Scott from Cluedo.
Yeah.
I imagine she'd sound.
Yeah, but she says, I'm sorry for you, Barry, because you don't know how to be loved. I'm getting here mixed up with a chap that phones in and says, I've got a beer and a can of beans. Come around my house afterwards. But again, there's a similar sort of sense of people trying to connect with him, but Champlain doesn't like it. And this sense of self-isolation, as we said earlier, that the studio's like a goldfish bowl. And at one point, he says, I'm really glad people like Kent are out there and I'm right here. But then later in the film, he invites Kent, the rocker, of course, into the studio. Yeah. And that sense of safety is eradicated, of course, at the end of the film when he's shot by the character played by Rocket's Red Glare.
And the safety is shattered before that, though, isn't it? When Kent reaches into his jacket, and you think he's pulling out a gun, obviously, because everything goes into slow motion. It's a camera, isn't it? And it's maybe a turning point for him because he realizes, well, hold on, people do ring up and tell me they know where I live and they threaten me and stuff. But look how close I've just come to being shot.
Exactly, yeah. And you get a cutaway to Bogosian as he reacts, as Kent pulls out this camera, and it's clear that Champlain thinks that that's a gun as well, isn't it? It's not just the others. But I mean, some of those contemporary reviews suggested that those flashbacks to Champlain's earlier career, where he was the like a tailor, isn't he? And then he meets the character played by Robert Trebor, Fisher, who invites him onto his show. They said that those sequences feel like padding, and I think, Ada, you mentioned that earlier. But those, I think, although the game you could lose that perhaps, but I think that sequence where you see Champlain in his first appearance on Fisher's radio show is quite integral, because it's mirrored in that later moment with Kent. Because, of course, Champlain goes on Fisher's show, he's provocative, he's antagonistic. And then later in the film, you see Kent go on Champlain's show, Night Talk, and he's provocative and antagonistic. And in the flashback, Fisher chews Champlain out, but the studio head invites him to his office and says, well, you've got your own show, kid. But how different, I think, is that? I think I was struck in that the way those sequences mirrored each other watching the film this time. How different is that from Champlain inviting Kent onto the show? And Champlain, like Fisher, seems disgusted at the younger mentees' outbursts. I don't know if that struck out of you, AD.
I don't know. I could see what you're saying. It didn't at the time, and I can see that kind of what one being two. But that notion of Champlain was Kent in that earlier situation sort of thing. But I don't know. It comes down to that. I know it's like show don't tell sort of thing, but this would have been better off because the film is so dialogue heavy. Because the film is relies on its snappy, punchy dialogue all the way through sort of thing, and keeping with that. For me, pushing it back and showing those sequences from his past, it broke me out of what I actually wanted from the film, which is the more enjoyable sequences. We know is how he got to where he is right now interesting, and especially the way they do it,
or even important.
Yeah, even important. Yeah. Is it interesting? Is it important? Would it be more important sort of thing, or more interesting to see how he got this worldview, which it doesn't seem to do. I mean, is there any event in his life that led him to that? It's like he's already, when he meets him in the clothes store, the DJ he gets in, and he just comes on and he's instantly into this role of going, hey, you know what? Look, we are holding hands, we are doing this. And it's like, well, okay, well, where has this come from? Where did this develop from? Because that maybe would have been more interesting, just rather than, oh well, this is how he got the job.
Yeah.
And I think that's the misstep for me in those sequences, and especially, you know, the sequence in the home where Ellen comes home and finds him having that party with John McGinley, the two girls sort of thing, two women, and obviously he's cheating on her sort of thing, and he's like, we know he's a, you know, in the phone call with her, we get the fact of like something's gone on and she can't trust him, and you know, we don't need to see all that. I don't know.
Yeah.
It felt like padding. I would have preferred, whether they just didn't have the material or they weren't confident in keeping the audience just for 3 nights in the radio, you know, station. Maybe they fell down into that typical, you know, filmic trope. We need to show where he came from and how he got the job and explain to people where he came from. And I was also put off by the terrible wig. If it is, so you know,
it's a Stern-esque wig.
It was very Howard Stern, wasn't it?
Yeah, I could go down that route if you really want me to, sort of thing. But as soon as that bit kicked back in, sort of thing, and I was like, you know, it's like, how do we make him younger? Just give him a bigger wig. Just give him, you know, he's got obviously tight curly hair. That's his hair. Well, just give him bigger curly hair. It's like, oh yeah, that's clearly what happens when people are younger. They just have bigger curly hair. I mean, I did, you know. So
looks like Slash if he worked in a tailor's.
Yeah, if I'm going out for the night, sort of thing, and I want to go to a nightclub or something like that, and I want to look a bit younger, I just put a big curly haired wig on. It works every time.
I do that, but I'm often confused with Diana Ross.
So you see, it can work. But I didn't like those sequences. I thought, and I get what you're saying about the parallels between that beginning, you know, that where we got his thing, but I just didn't think it was. They could have done it better. There could have been more. There was a more interesting angle to take about how his character got where he did, rather than what we actually got.
Yeah, I mean, I have a question for you though, and sort of in relation to that is Ellen Green's character, Champlain's ex-wife, and when he's introduced in his first show, and she calls in as an anonymous caller, and he sort of ridicules her, and she sort of squeals with glee, doesn't she? Mm-hmm. But then in the later sequences, in the sort of present day of the Digest, you might say, when she's worried that he's, in her words, going down in flames, she calls in as Cheryl Ann, doesn't she? And she expresses her love for Barry through her dissatisfaction with her current marriage. And Champlain's response is that he mocks her. He tells her that age-old story of is it Aesop's Fables, I think? As a dog with a bone in its mouth, who sees flesh in the water below, and he drops the bones back at the other dog, losing, of course, what it has, the bone, of course, in the process. And he says, "You blew it. Women like you are never happy. Your ex doesn't want you. He's out there having fun." And again, you know, there's this sense of these flashbacks being mirrored in the present. I don't know how you felt about that. Well,
see, to me, it would have been a bit more interesting if it's that we have to explain it, and I think maybe a better way of doing that would have had Cheryl Ann calling in the first sequence with no explanation.
Yeah.
And so in the opening bit where he's doing the thing, she's just another caller. And then he speaks to her on the phone, and you might recognize her voice on the phone when he calls her. And then obviously she does the call from within the thingy, and then you tie it all together that way. That she's still that way sort of thing. You know, she still has feelings for him, shown by the fact that she's still calling under this Cheryl Ann. You know, there could have been anything. Oh, it's Cheryl Ann again. We're one of our regular callers. Just as a throwaway line in that opening section would have, to me, sold that story just as well. I don't know.
Yeah.
If that does that make sense? Because then it would have relied on the audience actually piecing something together rather than, look, here's Cheryl Ann. It felt like it was, you know, Stone likes to hammer a point, but I can't help but feel at this point, these points sort of thing were just, you know, trying. The audience for this film sort of thing doesn't seem like the people who would need that explained to them.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
It's maybe a little bit patronising, perhaps.
Yes, yeah, that's what I took from it. I mean, obviously, I can see why, but whether it works or not, or whether there were better ways to do it, is what is kind of the angle I'm sort of coming at it from.
Yeah,
I'm not a huge fan of flashback personally. I'm reading a book at the minute called Silka's Journey, which is it follows a woman a young girl who survives Auschwitz and is immediately arrested by the Soviets and put in a gulag for 15 years, and throughout the book, there's flashbacks of something that happened in Auschwitz that relates very closely to something that's happening to her in the Gulag, and I mean, all right, it's hammering the point home that she's having a terrible time of it, and that these things are just constantly happening to her. But I'd much rather that the writer, or in this case, Stones, I'd much rather him. It's like Aidy said. I want to know why he is the character he is. If I think maybe the audience should be left to figure out, sort of how he's got to where he is. But I want to be shown maybe why he is how he is. I'm just not a fan of flashbacks. I find them a bit clunky and exposition-ish. And especially in this film, to be honest, because I didn't like the way they were presented, sort of all soft focus and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I really disliked that because it felt really out of tone for the film. It made it seem a bit more, I don't know, dare I say, chick flickish to me.
Yeah.
But and I also didn't like, frankly, I'm getting a bit negative now. I also didn't like the fact that his ex-wife rung in the second time, when he is going down in flames. I like the fact that she noticed it and she rung in to sort of help him, but I can't get on with the fact that she is suddenly there expressing a love for him and how she she doesn't want to be with her husband and she wants to be with him. Because for me personally, that came out of nowhere. Obviously there's still a connection between them because she's come all the way to Dallas for him, but I don't know. It felt like it just exploded into the film, and I just could have done without it, frankly.
Yeah. See, that's where I said if she'd have been referred to as a repeat caller earlier in the first sequence, just as then that would have maybe, oh, okay, she is keeping calling in. She's still, that sort of thing. I don't know. It's if you think, I mean, a sort of similar type of film sort of thing, close contact, lots of things. Obviously, is the film that I would liken this to would be Glengarry Glen Ross.
Yes, that's the Baldwin connection.
It is the Baldwin connection, yeah. Sort of but Baldwin's amazing in that sort of thing. It's incredible sort of thing. But and that doesn't, at least in my recollection of it, correct me wrong, sort of thing, but that doesn't feel the need to explain who these characters are, where they come from, and how they got to where they were.
Yes,
it's all in the moment, and I think this film would have done better to have done that. Maybe I'm being too negative because, like I said, 2/3 of it are great. 2/3 of it are pure Oliver Stone, and I love it. Oliver Stone tight, close in that sort of like that JFK around the thingy where you're getting that cutaways to when the Lee Harvey Oswald's photo is being doctored.
Yeah,
and they're all that long talk sort of thing where we're talking about Lee Harvey Oswald and his history in Russia and all sorts of things. It's that similar sort of style of direction, single location, moving camera, tight on people, lots of information being conveyed. And that's all great, but it loses its intensity, which is kind of what I wanted from this film, I think.
Yeah.
I definitely agree. Maybe it sort of softens the whole film a little bit, doesn't it? It's a toilet break moment for me.
That's a long toilet break.
I only go to the toilet once a week for half an hour.
I mean, you talk about show don't tell, but there is a good example of that in the film. I think when there's that Chet's call and he calls into the show and he suggests that Champlain should, quote, tell the truth about the people behind the shows, the people who pay the bills. And Champlain responds by telling him that story about the visit to Dachau and finding that Star of David, taking it home. And he says it's with him in the studio. He's holding it right now.
Holding it right now, but he's not, is he?
He's holding a mug of coffee. And you can sort of see, I mean, I think, as you... Mark, you're doing your PGC at the moment. Aidy and I have many years of education teaching under our belts, and sometimes you have to sort of provoke students to sort of lead them down the right path, and I think that's what I relate to in Champlain. That although sometimes the path he leads his callers down isn't the right path, but the sense that you have to sort of not manipulate reality, but certainly present it in a slightly different way to sort of cause students to question their ideology. And I think there's some parallels there between working in education and sort of that talk radio style job that Champlain has. Adi, would you agree, or?
Well, there's a question, isn't there? I wasn't. I kind of, you caught me off guard there, sort of thing. A little
Sorry.
That's all right. Would I? Yes, there is. You kind of do. I mean, a good HE lecturer sort of thing will always be trying to poke his students to think.
Yes.
That's one of the things I've sort of come to learn. You don't. You're trying to poke them into a certain way of looking at stuff and to sort of question stuff and be critical of things. Exactly. And sometimes that can mean taking a view that you don't always hold. To be a bit of an agent provocateur, to be a devil's advocate. And that is something certainly you get better at, and you learn to sort of play that role a little bit. I'm not going to say I'm a shock jock in the classroom, but certainly there are times, especially when you're discussing certain things, and if the discussion's maybe not going in a direction, or people are not going, you've got to sort of throw something out there that's a bit like a wake up call, like what about this in this game? Do you think that from obviously my point of view, do we think this? And I know my students, and I know there are certain buttons to press, when I want to sort of get a reaction or get something going again. And that there is something in that. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And you just learn it, don't you? You could become better at it. How to sort of, and I don't know, is that maybe that's the thing with Champlain sort of thing, the difference between him as a thing, maybe Champlain just needed a PowerPoint behind him sort of thing, so he knew where his lessons were going to go, or his talk shows were going to go, sort of thing. So, we have a bit of that, luxury, I guess. But yeah, there's certainly elements to that. Yeah, I would say you've got all this fun to come, Mark.
I can't wait.
Mark, your experiences, do you think, do you sort of relate to that?
Well, on the PGC course, there was a lesson that we had, in which we were split into two halves of the group, and we had to have a debate with each other. This is back in the old days where we're actually, in the university.
Yeah.
In the before time.
I should contextualise this with some sort of explanation that everything is being delivered online at the moment because of the pandemic and so on.
Well, no, you say that, but actually my course is allowed to go in and learn at the centre.
Yeah, PGCs are, yeah.
Are they?
Yeah. But the students I teach, I have to teach online. But I'm allowed to go in person somehow. I don't know why, but
no comment.
I digest. And we were split into two halves, and we were given one half of a debate. My half was that all children and students should be educated to the best of their ability, no matter what. The other half was that students who are more likely, it's hard to word, but basically students that are more likely and come from a better social background and are more likely to achieve should receive the better education, while students who are of a worse off social background and aren't likely to achieve should just be sort of given what they get.
Can I interject and say how politically loaded is that sort of premise? But anyway, let's move on.
Well, it was. We were sent off for a while to do some research, and then we came back, and basically I exploded. I said that I don't understand why we should have to research that argument. It's because it's wrong, and it's but anyway, that's a different story. But then our tutor came back and said, well, as a teacher, you are going to have to look at different ways of thinking and potentially upsetting people.
Valid point. And
it's like you said, it's like Eddie said, you've got to sort of poke people into thinking. Yeah, I've only been on a placement since September, and I've already had a situation where I've annoyed the students because I gave them a task in which they had to rewrite the intro to an Edgar Allan Poe story. Yeah, none of them liked me for it. But I was just trying to get them to think about language. But you shouldn't shy away from potentially annoying students, I don't think.
Yeah.
As long as annoying them into learning.
Yeah, I think that's the job description, isn't it? Or it should be.
People into learning. That's why I'm so good at it.
You know, I don't want to get too much of a sidebar, but I think when I say this to the wife very often, and like I say, she works in the primary school, and we both have situations where students disclose things to us that are very upsetting. And I think, you know, when you enter into teaching, that's the last thing you expect is some of the disclosures that I've had. You've probably had the same AD. You might have had the same Mac. And things that really shock you to the core of your humanity, you know, and a bit like and what I relate to in this film, I think, is Champlain, when some of these characters articulate things that you can see that Bogosian in his performance is shocked. He's shocked into silence. He doesn't know how to respond. And without giving too much details of some of the things that have been disclosed to me in the past, that I find that very, very relatable, I think.
Well, it's like the sequence where the guy rings up who, you know, says he's going to rape someone again. That whole sequence is particularly unpleasant. It's particularly unpleasant, that sequence.
I don't want to go into too much details, but similar situation. I have been had disclosures of a similar level, and it's probably the last thing that you think when you go into teaching, much as the last thing that you think you're going to be is going to be disclosed to you when you go into working in radio, for example. How do you handle that? Silence, is shock, utter sort of withdrawal at the inhumanity that people can present, or that can be at the core of people's self, and you know, I think that's something that I relate to very much in Bogosian's performance. I think as Champlain, that I struggle to see how someone like maybe Dustin Hoffman might articulate that. Anyway, that's gone down a very bleak path.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I don't have anything wrong with Bogosian's performance in this film. I think he's excellent. I think he's really good. But it's just that middle third. That's my only problem. I think he's, you know, I just wanted more of him at the mic.
I mean, the other thing that I've got in my notes that we've not really talked about yet is that you know, when the threats start to pile up, the voices of the people that are making the threats are indistinguishable. You've got the neo-Nazis, you've got the grudges, and so on and so forth. And there's that moment as well that again sort of refers back. And I don't want to get into too much detail about personal circumstances, but things that I've had disclosed to me working in education, where that guy, he provokes that caller who admits to hitting his small child with a belt, and that man says, "I know where you live, I know what you look like." And at that point, we realise that the threats don't just come from the neo-Nazis, but certainly from the other callers that call in with various
just general folk.
Exactly, yeah. With problems.
That was Michael Wincott again, wasn't it?
I think it was Wincott. Yeah.
I think it was.
So, like I say, the fact that the different callers call in with the same voices, the same actors, deliberately confuses the matter and sort of causes them to overlap.
Do you think that was a deliberate, or do you think that was just they couldn't get many more actors? Think it was to keep the budget down, or do you think it was a deliberate production technique to actually cause confusion in the viewer?
I think it's a deliberate choice to cause confusion in the viewer, because I think, as I understand, that was deliberate in the stage show to cause confusion, that these different voices call in. The Alan Berg references weren't in the stage show, but certainly the overlap of voices were there, I think, as I understand it anyway. So. And there's that moment as well, to go back to what we said about Champlain and this ranting about his ego. My show, I'll put who I want on my show. If I want to put Charlie Manson on my show, I'll put him on my show. And Dan says to him, "What you are, Barry, is a fucking suit salesman with a big mouth," which again I think is working education is probably something that we can all relate to. Aidy's laughing.
I don't think I would ever say that to one of my students, though.
No, we've had it said to us
Oh right, yeah.
yeah. And I think Mark, if you carry on the trajectory you're on, you'll get there eventually.
I'm just emailing my tutor asking if I can change to like
But I mean, the film ends with that moment. It's towards the end. Barry says to, is it to Dan? He says, "I'll be back tomorrow," and Dan says, sort of expresses, Barry says maybe, and Dan says, "Well, where else are you going to go?" sort of thing, and Barry talks to Stu afterwards, and he says, "Why am I doing it?" And Stu says, "I don't know, Barry. If you can't stand the heights, don't climb the mountains, man." Which is a great piece of sort of hippie-esque philosophy, I think. But certainly it kind of points to what Champlain's doing is sort of. I think again, this is another thing that I talk about in education a lot, and I don't want to get sidelined too much by it. But this notion of a vocation, and we talk about that, vocational education as being about sort of job-related learning. But vocation is a calling, isn't it, in the true sense? And it's something that you do regardless of whether you are sort of rewarded for it, paid for it, or whatever. And I think you get this sense that Champlain, even though he doesn't quite understand what it is, what his function is, that he does it because it's a vocation like the priesthood, or some sort of calling. I think that he's engineered into. And you quoted that great line earlier, AD, where Champlain talks about this marvelous technology that's at disposable. Instead of reaching out up to new heights, we're going to see how far down we could go, how deep into the muck we can immerse ourselves. You're pathetic. I despise each and every one of you. You have nothing, no brains, no power, no future, no hope, no God. The only thing you believe in is me, the media, in other words. And then there's that moment, and this is how the play ends. There's that moment with 60 seconds of dead air, silence on the mic. And Barry breaks it by saying, "I guess we're stuck with each other," I think, which is quite powerful, quite meaningful. And then over the opening credits, we've got Telephone and Rubber Band by the Penguin Cafe Orchestra, which mentally, I know it's wrong, but I always struggle to separate it from that Space Hog track in the meantime in the mid-90s. Which was used over the end credits, and I don't know, AD, you might have seen this. Mark, you might be, you whippersnapper, you might be too young to have seen this. So, AD, can you remember Michael Almereyda's Nadja, the vampire film, with some of the sequences shot in pixel vision? The closing credits of that used a lot of Portishead on the soundtrack, but the closing credits of that used the Space Hog track.
I don't remember that now. I'm sorry, that's beyond me as well. I'll leave that one just to you, Paul.
But when I watch the end of Talk Radio, the closing credits, I think of the Almereyda film Nadja with the Space Hog track over the end of it. I don't know. I mean,
I was disappointed. They were at the end of a Frasier series where you get the headshots of all the actors who have called in. I wanted that. Yeah. Thanks for calling, and then there's all these different pictures of people. I wanted that. That had tied it up in a neat bow for me.
Yeah. Well, I like that you mentioned Frasier earlier. It was sort of as a bit of a sidebar, but Frasier has a similar thing with the voices, doesn't it? The actors that call in as the people seeking sort of guidance from Frasier, and I do look at Frasier. Which I'm not a big fan, I have to say, of American sitcoms generally, but Frasier I do find quite consistently fascinating, and I did watch that on television from the first year, was it 91, 92, something like that, till the last season.
I mean, there's another link to another decent American sitcom that was good for quite a while as well, with McGinley, isn't there, with Scrubs.
Well, of course, yeah.
I know it's not this, so just as a sidebar there, but I do like Scrubs.
Yeah. But I think the
In fact, McGinley was he was in an episode of Frasier, actually. Thinking about
He
it,
was, yeah.
McGinley's in everything. That's the thing. It's like, oh, it's the guy in the helicopter in Seven. He just pops up all over the place.
Yeah, that's true.
With his little curly head of hair.
Yeah, yeah. Point
Break. Less so, yeah. But
is it worth, just as I know you mentioned this at the beginning, sort of thing, but the film, apart from Glengarry Glen Ross, and just to sort of say, the ending rant or the ending talk sort of thing, is it? Do you think it's purposeful, or is it obviously riffing off Network? I'm not going to take. We're not going to take it anymore. The big thing at the end of that. Do you think is that purposeful, or do you think it's not? Or I don't know. What do you think? What do you think?
Well, I think even if it's riffing on Network, it's still purposeful. In the sense of commenting on the media landscape. I mean, as I said earlier, there was before Stone was attached to direct the film. There was Lumet was attached, and I think it was Lumet that suggested that Hoffman should play Champlain.
Really,
and you can kind of see that. I think, like I said, there's a thread that runs from this or from Network to this. I think, in terms of and a linkage that you can make between Champlain and Peter Finch's character in Network. I think, and I think that's kind of very astute. In the 90s, you get that extended slightly with Stone's examination of particularly the Robert Downey Jr. character in Natural Born Killers.
Yes, yeah.
And later on, you've got, you might have seen this, AD, it's been forgotten about since it came out, but Series 7, The Contenders, which was quite a dark look at the reality TV phenomenon.
Yeah, that does ring a bell.
Yeah, and, also you've got another example, and Mark, you might be too young to remember this, but the host on the film adaptation of The Running Man. Do you remember that? Have you seen that?
I don't want anything to do with running. I don't like exercise.
The
Schwarzenegger film, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, which was played by... forgive me. Sorry, I'm not a...
He's a game show host, wasn't he? He is
the game show host. Yeah, the game show host. Yeah, I've forgotten his name.
This makes a good podcasting.
Richard Dawson.
Yeah. Who do you love?
Yeah. If you've not seen that, Mark, watch it. Do you know what? My daughter is... she's 14 years old now, and I made her watch as a sort of a, there was a reward attached to it. The Running Man. She loves that film. She absolutely loves that film, and even she can see the parallels between that and sort of today's sort of TV landscape. But it's I know it's a Schwarzenegger movie, but it's an incredible film. I think, in my opinion, But anyway, I'll leave it at that.
But it's not worth losing your head over. Let's put it that way.
Yes, yeah. Does anybody have any comments they want to wrap up with, or?
Mark, do you want to go?
Nothing in particular. I mean, I've only watched it really the once, but there's a lot of sort of new ideas and analyses that you guys have brought up, which I can see in the film. And my personal take away from it was that it was sort of a scathing indictment of America, really, and how no matter what, that sort of anti-Semitism and that racism will always appear and rear its ugly head, no matter how hard you try and stamp it out. And unfortunately, it's become prophetic in a way, hasn't it? that it's still rife today, especially with radio hosts like Rush Limbaugh, who's also very political and provocative, and yeah, I found it not upsetting, but whenever you see films like this where people are abused and for their religious beliefs or for their race or for their colour, it's just a sad reminder of the world we tend to populate, unfortunately. But saying that, I did enjoy it. I enjoyed watching Bogosian at the mic. I thought he acted it very well. Especially, I said earlier, especially like the touches of when he was at the mic, his voice being clearer. I thought that was a nice little touch. But yeah, that was my lasting impression. It's, unfortunately, it seems that that's the way that the world will always behave and always seem to be. Because even here we are, 20 years later, and it's still pretty much the same, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially considering it's in the city where JFK was shot, and what a nice young man he was.
Yeah, it's 30 years, isn't it?
Yeah. It's 88.
How time flies.
Yeah.
AD.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I a slightly different take. I can see what Mike's saying there, or something. But for me, that what I took away was that quote what I said about the use of technology to, how. The comment of if you put this great technology in the hands of people, sort of thing, they'll just usurp it for nefarious, horrible ends. And like when I was sat here, watching it with my partner, sort of thing, and he's doing that speech, and he says that line, I was like, good lord, you could put that now, sort of thing, and he's just talking about Twitter, he's just talking about Instagram, he's just talking about Snapchat or TikTok, or anything like that, sort of thing, where
so relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. Or, Facebook and everything we've had over the past few years. With Cambridge Analytica and all that kind of use of technology to actually drive political viewpoints and everything like that. And, instead of using it to, open our minds, and I don't wish to sound all hippie-ish or anything like that, but, to better humanity, we've just used it it's just become another form of control. And it's the next step along, religion, media, now it's the internet. It's just another form of control. People are so obsessed with what other people are saying online, sort of thing, and they forgot actually, there's what's going on really in the world. And I don't want to go down that route, sort of thing, but I'll start sounding like a conspiracy theorist and what have you, sort of thing. But hey ho, and I think that was the thing that I took away from this. But it was ultimately the notion that the vacuity of people's opinions and stuff, and there's that, everybody's got an opinion, everyone's got a right to talk, and everyone likes that. Yeah, fine enough, sort of thing. But you really, should they? Because most people don't have anything to say, which is ironic, sort of thing.
Opinion, if you allow them to speak it.
Yeah, which is ironic, seeing as we're voicing our opinions on a podcast. One could say, what's our right to actually do this podcast? It's like, yeah, it's fair enough. But it's I think that's you put that power into everybody's hands, sort of thing, and what you end up with, sort of thing, is just a wall of noise, really. And I think that's what I took away from this film, sort of thing, and that's what ultimately spoke to me the most about it.
It's unbelievable the power that anonymous, just sort of online hatred can have, isn't it? Like, for instance, if you look at the recent Capitol riots in America, the other day I read I saw a headline, someone who's being formally charged in Scotland over an offensive tweet. What I mean? It's just, at first I thought that's ridiculous, but then when I read what he'd put, I thought, actually, no, that is horrible. But it's just amazing what people will do when they haven't got a face, if you know what I mean. They're just sat behind a keyboard, they can say what they want.
Yeah. I mean, there's history of like people being doxxed or people being swatted and all that kind of stuff, and it's what can you say? It's supposed to be a good thing, but it turns out that people can't be trusted to some degree, I think. Maybe. I don't know. Who am I on my soapbox to say that?
With 7 billion people in the world, there's always going to be a difference of opinion somewhere, isn't there?
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to end it on that great quote from, is it the Deadpool or Sudden Impact? opinions are like ourselves. Everybody's got one.
Everyone's got.
Yeah. And it'd be nice to end this with that sort of homage to Champlain. He ends that show with 60 seconds of da-da and says, "I guess we're stuck with each other." But you know.
Well, I'm honouring it in my own way, and I'm currently stood with my laptop turning in a circle.
And I think with that, with that image, we'll say goodbye.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
This country is in deep trouble, people. This country is rotten to the core, and somebody better do something about it. I want you to take your hand out of that bowl of Fritos, throw away your National Enquirer, and pick up the phone. Go ahead, pick it up, hold it up to your face, and dial 555-TALK. Open your mouth and tell me what we're going to do about the mess this country's in. Talk radio. It's the last neighborhood in town. People just don't talk to each other anymore. Let's go to the first caller. Night Talk, Agnes. Yeah.
I love Lucy. Now why don't they make more of them?
Those shows are ancient, Agnes. Lucille Ball must be at least 105 years old. The rest of the cast is dead.
Barry, Metrowave's going to be picking up the show starting Monday night, link it to a national feed.
We have a very special guest with us. Kent is the classic American youth, energetic and resourceful, spoiled, perverse, and disturbed. Would you say that's an accurate description, Kent?
Barry, you should ask me if you want to have a guest on the show.
Why?
Because I'm the boss, Barry, that's why.
All you have to do is just be nice, okay?
Now, easy, Barry. You're part of the problem, you see.
I don't care what you think. No one does.
He's going down in flames, Dan.
So what?
You get the package I sent down to the station.
See, if I were you, I'd have my pretty assistant give the police a call. Take the bomb squad about 10 minutes to get down
Bomb
there
squad?
to the
Why
station.
should I call a bomb squad? Tell me something. I'm curious. How do you dial a phone with a straitjacket on?